Chair, council members, and participants, we are now live.
I understand that state law currently requires that the following announcement be made at the beginning of every remote public hearing as follows. Due to the current public health emergency, city council committees are currently meeting remotely. We are using Microsoft Teams to make these remote hearings possible. Instructions for how the public may view and offer public testimony at public hearings of council committees are included in the public hearing notices that are published in the Daily News, the Inquirer, and the Legal Intelligencer prior to the hearings, and can also be found on phlcouncil.com. I now note that the hour has come. Rachel, will you please call the roll to take attendance? Members that are in attendance, will you please indicate by saying that you are present, and when your name is called, also just say a few brief additional words so that your image will be displayed on screen when you speak.
Vice Chair Derek Green.
Present, here for the hearing.
Councilmember Cindy Bass.
Good morning, I am present. Thank you very much.
Councilmember Curtis Jones.
Okay, all right, no problem. Bye-bye.
I'll come back to him. Councilmember Mark Squilla.
Present.
Councilmember Helen Gim.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning, colleagues.
And Councilmember Curtis Jones.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Madam Chair.
Good morning, Councilman.
Those are the members who are present right now.
Thank you. A quorum of the committee is present, and this hearing is now called to order. This is the public hearing of the Committee on Law and Government regarding bill numbers 200588, 200589, and 200590. Rachel, will you please read the title of the bills?
Bill number 200588, an ordinance amending Title 17 of the Philadelphia Code entitled Contracts and Procurement by amending Chapter 17-100 entitled Procurement Contracts to add disclosure requirements related to prior contracting experience and the demographic characteristics of employees and board members of contractors and subcontractors for city contracts for competitively bid goods, and by adding reporting requirements all under certain terms and conditions. Bill number 200589, an ordinance amending Chapter 17-100 entitled Procurement Contracts by adding requirements related to the provision of information regarding the demographic characteristics of the employees of and the labor force used by city contractors and subcontractors in the performance of work under certain city contracts for competitively bid services, all under certain terms and conditions. And Bill number 200590, an ordinance amending Title 17 of the Philadelphia Code entitled Contracts and Procurement by amending Chapter 17-100 entitled Procurement Contracts and Chapter 17-1400 entitled Non-Competitively Bid Contracts Financial Assistance to add disclosure requirements related to prior contracting experience and the demographic characteristics of employees, other sources of labor, and board members of contractors and subcontractors for city contracts for public works, other competitively bid services, and professional services, and by adding reporting requirements, all under certain terms and conditions.
Before we begin to hear testimony from the witnesses we have for today, everyone who has been invited to the meeting to testify should be aware that this public hearing is being recorded. Because the hearing is public, participants and viewers have no reasonable expectation of privacy. By continuing to be in the meeting, you are consenting to be recorded. Additionally, prior to recognizing members for questions or comments, comments they have for 4 witnesses. I will note for the record at this time that we will use the chat feature available in Microsoft Teams to allow members to signify that they wish to be recognized. In order to comply with the Sunshine Act, the chat feature must only be used for this purpose. Before I ask Rachel to call our first panel for bill numbers 200258, 200589, and 200590, I would like to make some opening comments. And so I want to just quickly give everyone an overview of the 3 bills being heard today. Together, these bills comprise what we've named the Dr. Walter P. Lomax Jr. Transparency in Business Act. And as many of you know, Dr. Walter P. Lomax Jr. was a physician, an entrepreneur, and a philanthropist, as well as the founder of the Lomax Companies. That's the corporate umbrella for real estate investment firm Lomax Real Estate Partners, technology firms Prime Image, and My Artist DNA and Word Radio. Dr. Lomax was laser focused on ensuring that Black and brown people had access to economic opportunity. Several of his firms were successful in winning highly competitive bids to provide services to both municipal and state government. And Dr. Lomax was also keenly aware that some of his success came from the role of government in helping to give him, as a Black man, access to economic opportunity. I want to say a special thank you to the Lomax family for giving their approval and blessing of naming this package after Dr. Lomax. The Dr. Walter P. Lomax Jr. Transparency in Business Act, it aims to bring transparency specifically around the areas of diversity and inclusion to municipal contracts. In more simpler terms, it aims to answer the following questions and a little more. They are: who are the firms benefiting from doing business with the city? What are the demographics of these firms in terms of race, ethnicity, and gender? What do these firms' executive teams look like? What does their staffing look like? What are their staffer salary ranges? And what does their length of employment look like? This legislative package requires any firm that does business with the city to provide demographic data of its staff, executives, and board. Demographic data is defined as statistical information on a group of individuals aggregated by specific characteristics that are including but not limited to race, ethnicity, gender identity, job title, salary range, length of employment, and such other characteristics as may be established by regulation. This bill applies to both contracts for goods and services. As an example of goods, I've been sharing that paper bought from Staples or vehicles bought from Ford. An example of services is a law firm, hired to handle court cases, or an accounting firm, hired to do some work for the city. I also want to clarify some details with regards to when this demographic disclosure will be required. The bills are currently written so that no contract shall be entered with a bidder or contractor who does not agree to disclose demographic information. So theoretically, a bidder could win. But if they refuse to agree to disclose this information, then a contract would not, and I will repeat, would not be entered into. If they do agree to disclose, then a contract would be entered, and they would be required to disclose the demographic information as determined by the regulations. If they end up not disclosing this information, then it is considered a breach of contract, and the city could terminate, seek damages, or pursue any other relief it considers appropriate based on this violation of the contract. One other thing I want to mention, specifically for public works contracts that are more than $100,000, Bill number 200590 acknowledges that a contractor may not know the full scope of work or who their subcontractors will be after entering into a contract. Well, to get around that, this bill will require them to provide the demographic data on each labor source, which will often be something like a union hall, from which firms are likely to draw workers, including data on race, ethnicity, gender identity, job title, salary range, and length of employment. Disclosures shall be submitted to the Department of Labor or such other office as designated by the mayor at such times as determined by the regulation. No later than April 1st of each year, the Director of Labor or such other office as designated by the mayor shall provide an annual report to the mayor and the clerk of council summarizing the disclosures received during the previous calendar year. And a copy of the report, and this is what we are extremely proud of from a transparency perspective, will not sit on someone's desk. It shall be posted on the city's official website. I am offering up some amendments today. Now, most of the amendments are technical. However, there are two more substantive amendments that are being made to all three bills. The first amendment, it adds in the percentage of employees that are Philadelphia residents to the definition of demographic data. We didn't use zip codes because for many firms, individually reporting that data by zip code can become a tad bit laborious. But by asking a firm what percentage of your employees are Philadelphia residents, that appeared to be much more feasible. The second amendment, it changes the implementation date to the beginning of the next fiscal year, which is July 1st, 2021. Now that I've gone over some of the details of the legislation, I want to briefly discuss why this legislation is so important. You all know that we are in a time of great change in this country. Some have likened what is currently happening to a 21st century civil rights movement. One positive is that, and I've been really excited about seeing many firms, many more than in the past, now become comfortable with publicly saying that Black Lives Matter and putting forth many diversity, equity, and inclusion mission statements on their website or in newspapers. With that being said, we still are in a position where we have failed to significantly move the needle on having the firms that manage contracts for the city be reflective of our population. And not only that, we don't fully know who is benefiting and building wealth from doing business with our local government. We should be the example for the private sector to follow. This legislation will bring transparency to what has traditionally been an opaque contracting process. And in my opinion, it will also help to level the playing field for minority and women-owned firms. Currently, many of those firms go through this rigorous process to get certified as an MWDBE firm. And then they register with the city. And we comb through that process from the beginning to the end. But then we said to ourselves, you know, what do non-minority firms, owned firms, have to do in order to bid on contracts with the city? And the answer is nothing. All they have to do is bid. So while our efforts have been well-intentioned, it's almost as if the system that we've created to help MWDSBE firms has instead placed an even heavier burden on them in terms of both money and time. If you have to hire an accountant and or a lawyer and they are not in-house. We need to bring transparency to our current system. The people of Philadelphia have the right to know who is benefiting from and building wealth by doing business with the city. This is a necessary first step, and the time to do it is now. And I look forward to hearing the testimony today, as well as the great discussion that I'm sure we'll have with our colleagues who are members of the committee. Rachel, will you please call the first panel we have to testify this afternoon on bill numbers 200588, 200589, and 200590?
Madam Chair, before we call the witnesses, I'd like to make a quick comment.
Sure. Thank you, Vice Chair Green.
Thank you. I want to thank you for this legislation named after outstanding entrepreneur that's been a leader in the city, Dr. Walter P. Lomax. And the transparency that you're providing to this legislation is something that's definitely needed. I know Ms. Tipton, our Chief Administrative Officer, will talk about in her testimony the local business purchasing initiative legislation that I've done. But this is some additional legislation that helps us move the needle as a city. We as a city need to be doing a better job of using the resources that come from all the members of City Council who are taxpayers, all the citizens, all the employees of the city, and the small business owners. We need to do a better job of using those resources to grow entrepreneurship opportunities in the city of Philadelphia for local-based businesses, more particularly businesses of color, and then even more importantly, African-American owned businesses. We should be using the city as an economic development engine. And the way we do that is by buying more goods and services from businesses based in this city that are from and based on communities of color and African-American owned businesses in the city of Philadelphia. I think this legislation helps to provide a better spotlight on the type of businesses that are doing work in the city, and it helps us to move the needle so that way we can truly use the city as an economic development agency to address poverty in our city. So thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Vice Chair Green. I appreciate those comments and the work that you have done in trying to incentivize the buying of services and goods locally. And so I want to acknowledge you for that. I also want to note for the record that Councilmember Maria Quinones Sanchez is in attendance here. So thank you, Councilwoman Sanchez, for joining us. And Rachel, please call the first panel.
The first panel is Stephanie Tipton.
Good morning. Can you hear me okay? I'm sorry, I'm calling in from my phone, so just want to make sure.
Yes, we can hear you well. Just please state your name for the record and feel free to proceed with your testimony.
Great, thank you. My name is Stephanie Tipton. I'm the Chief Administrative Officer for the City of Philadelphia. Good morning, Councilmember Parker, Chair of the Committee on Law and Government, co-sponsor of today's bills, Vice Chair Green, and other members of the committee. As I mentioned, I'm Stephanie Tipton. I'm the Chief Administrative Officer for the city. I'm joined today by Monique Neesmith-Joyner, who is our Procurement Commissioner, as well as T. David Williams, who is the Deputy Chief Administrative Officer and Director of the Contracts Legislation Unit within my office. And we're here to provide testimony on bill numbers 200588, 200589, and 200590. Just by way of background, my office, the CAO for short, is charged with oversight of the city's core administrative departments and functions, including the Procurement Department and the Contracts Legislation Unit, which helps to oversee professional services contracting. Our goal is to ensure that city services are efficient and effective, inclusive and equitable, transparent, and conducted with integrity. Bill numbers 200588, 200589, and 200590, which are collectively known as the Dr. Walter P. Lomax Jr. Transparency in Business Act, or the ACT, seeks to increase transparency in city contracting by requiring that any business entering into a contract with the city publicly disclose various demographic information for their workforce and boards. The Act would also require that the contractor disclose information regarding their contracts with the city over the previous 5 years, if applicable, and would also apply to contractors and subcontractors. And then the information, as you mentioned, would be publicly posted on phila.gov. The CAO and procurement support any effort at increasing transparency and access to information related to city contracts. We really appreciate Councilmember Parker's willingness to meet with us to discuss the act and really work with us to implement its provisions and consider a few amendments to the bills, which we discussed a bit yesterday. The act will serve to complement several initiatives already underway that are specifically aimed at increasing access to and simplifying the process for city contracts, in particular for small, local, and diverse businesses. Councilmember Green mentioned our local business purchasing initiative, which I think was really key to helping to remove barriers and increase transparency around city contracts. And we think that's just a win-win for both the city and businesses. So we really thank you again, Councilmember Parker, for introducing this legislation. So just to give you a little bit of background about LBPI, which I think helps to illuminate some of the amendments that we've requested. We partnered with Councilmember Green and the Office of Economic Opportunity to develop the local business purchasing initiative, which launched this September. Really central to this initiative was raising the threshold for when a formal bid or request for proposal is required from $34,000 to $100,000 when the opportunity is opened only to certified local business entities, or LBE. The purpose of this is to reduce many of the barriers of entry for these contracts. In particular, the companion procurement regulations that were also promulgated require departments to actively solicit at least 3 minority women disabled-owned business proposals on these opportunities. And on an annual basis, the procurement department has to issue an annual report on local and MWDSBE participation on the contracts issued under the program, which again would be publicly posted as well. In conjunction with LBPI, we also launched the Contracts Hub, which centralizes all of the city's contract opportunities onto one user-friendly portal and provides information for businesses on how to navigate the contracting process. Additionally, over the last year, my office has implemented various legislative and regulatory changes that help clarify and streamline the application and disclosure requirements for non-competitively bid contracts, which are primarily for professional services. So for that reason, we believe that some of the amendments we propose to the Act will really complement these efforts, and we appreciate your willingness to hear, to talk with us about some of those amendments. So specifically, we propose adjusting the disclosure threshold for all contracts to $100,000 in order to remain consistent with the LBPI ordinance. And I'm happy to provide a bit more information if you have questions about why we think that's important to have that consistency. Additionally, it's our understanding from the bill sponsor, and you did mention this in your opening, and I appreciate that, the intent of the Act is to capture disclosure information prior to the contract being executed and not at the time of application. So I think one of the second amendment that we've proposed would adjust that language of the Act to really mirror the intent. And further, as we shared with Councilmember Parker, there are several other legally mandated disclosure requirements right now in place for contractors that capture similar or the same information as the disclosures requested under the Act. As we discussed yesterday, I think we would like this Act to be sort of the law of the land, if you will, for contracts. And so it's our hope that City Council will work with us to streamline and consolidate some of these requirements under this Act, which will, again, really help to minimize any duplicative reporting required by city contractors. And lastly, the Act's provisions will require us to make updates to our internal contracting systems, which will enable sort of the seamless submission and review of the new disclosures, as well as the posting of them on an annual basis on the city's website. Unfortunately, the cost of these updates will impact our budget, and we will likely require some additional funding to implement those provisions. So I just want to put that on the record. So before I conclude, I want to again just thank you, Councilmember Parker, for introducing the Act, really being willing to being open to our input and really allowing us the opportunity to work collaboratively with you on the implementation. And I just want to also thank Councilmember Green. I think both of you have really really worked very closely with my office on, moving the needle and helping to streamline a lot of the provisions within our contracting laws and really opening up the access and transparency around these contracts for local and diverse businesses. So we really appreciate all your work and really leading on this effort. So that concludes my testimony, and we're all here and we're happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Stephanie, so very much for your testimony. And I do want to state for the record that the Second Amendment proposal to Bill 200590, it addresses that applicant issue that we discussed yesterday. So we already have that language drafted. In addition to that, I want to note for the record that I appreciate your acknowledging that additional funding will be needed to ensure that the legislation is effectively enforced and that the disclosures are monitored for accuracy. And I just want to note for the record that Council President Darrell Clark has also introduced some legislation, again, that could, sort of be viewed as the partner to this package, but we won't be hearing that from a public hearing perspective until 21. And again, we're interested in working very closely with your office to get that done. The chair recognizes Councilmember Derek Green. Is that from earlier, Councilmember Green?
Yeah, that was from earlier. Thank you.
Okay, all right. Councilwoman Sanchez.
Thank you, Councilwoman and Councilmember Green, for all of the work around this space. It's wonderful to see that council has and will continue to be committed and thoughtful in its process to streamline and create these opportunities. My question to Stephanie is, in light of the fact that the council member was willing to align some of this work around the $100,000 threshold, which allows for better monitoring and evaluation, what goals, if any, are you as a department setting up for the operating department so that they open up opportunities in this range? So what I'm saying is, how are we going to debundle some of the contracts that we have, and what is our goals for creating opportunities within this threshold in the different departments? And just like we set up minority goals, what would be important for me is, and not now, but during our budget session, is for departments to be able to report out what opportunities they think exist and what opportunities they're going to create within the next year. Thank you.
Sure. So when we established the new bidding thresholds under the LBPI initiative, one of the things we were very intentional about was setting up very clear expectations within the regulations that we promulgated. One of the expectations, which actually is a bit stronger than what we were doing previously on contracts that were under the formal bidding threshold, was requiring that departments provide documentation that they did an outreach to at least three minority, women, or disabled-owned businesses or other alternative diverse businesses. So there's other registries out there for diverse businesses. And the contract's not going to get executed unless they provide documentation of that. So OEO is now part of the workflow for these contracts and contracts in general. They can check and verify if the department did what they said they were going to do. And that was actually something that we, wanted to make sure was very clear within the regulation. So just because it's a more streamlined and expeditious process, so there's less sort of paperwork up front for the vendor, and the process to execute the contracts is faster. We still wanted to make sure that there was a level of outreach to businesses on these contracts. So that was one thing that we were very intentional about with the regulations. And I think, we'll be able to, check that, frankly, which was something that, we didn't necessarily have as much teeth to do previously before we did the regulations on those contracts. So, that is the expectation. And I think when we do the annual reporting, which is also something that we laid out in the regulations. The procurement department has to issue an annual report under the local business purchasing initiative regulations to demonstrate what kind of participation there was by local and diverse businesses on these contracts. And so that's something, again, transparency. We're going to be very public about it. We'll be able to share that information with council if they're interested in it, which I'm sure you would be. And so we'll be able to see how we're doing. And if we're not doing well, it'll allow us the opportunity to course correct, which is exactly why we put the reporting requirements on there. So our hope is that, we will see an increased level of participation on these more informal contracts, and hopefully incentivize both the businesses and departments to participate in the contracts themselves.
Well, thank you, Stephanie. But what I'm looking for is a requirement by departments to provide the opportunities, right? If there's only 3 opportunities in a department, and if there was only 3 before, there's 2 later. I think part of what I'm looking is on a department basis, particularly those departments that come to council every year and don't meet their thresholds. Every single department that's not meeting their participation threshold should be required to debundle and come up with these opportunities to grow and build those opportunities within those departments. So that's the conversation, for the budget cycle that I'll be looking to you folks to provide, because I think that's an important part of this procurement reform. One is we create the toolboxes, and council has, again, been very, very thoughtful around the toolboxes. The other is the utilization of the toolboxes by department. And so we're open to those conversations. I don't want to hear the bigger departments who claim, they can only put out multi-million dollars and they know there's no one in the field and there's no one to grow. I don't want them to use that as an excuse to get out of it. So part of it is, and again, this is going to take a while. This is new. You're streamlining it, you're aligning it, and all of those things are important so that it could work. Then it could be measured. But then part of it is then what are the goal setting that we set up department to department. So thank you very much, and we look forward. Again, this is part of the toolbox. Not the answer to everything, but definitely we need departments to cooperate. And after being in council 13 years, it's very frustrating to hear commissioners and department folks tell me, well, we didn't have an opportunity. There was no one in this field. We got to grow it. And part of growing is creating the opportunities. And I know Mr. Harold Epps is going to be speaking soon, and he will speak to a little bit of that in his experience in the Department of Commerce. But thank you.
Thank you, Council Member Sanchez. Just a point of information for the benefit of the public. I want you to know that the $100,000 threshold is currently only for public works contracts, not for other contracts. The administration is asking for a $100,000 threshold across the board for all contracts, and we are in discussions with them now, but you will not see any amendments today reflecting that, because we will continue to have discussions about that issue. Next, the chair recognizes Councilmember Gim.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I want to acknowledge the work that you put into this important legislation. I just had a very quick question for Stephanie. Can you clarify whether information is currently available on a bidding contractor's past history on issues such as environmental protection, taxation, labor standards, and employment discrimination? I know that this information is typically required as a part of disclosure for entities receiving financial assistance subsidies, and I'm curious whether it applies during the bidding and procurement process.
So I wouldn't say that we specifically request that information from all applicants. What we do request is sort of the applicant profile in the past 5 years, if they've had contracts similar in size and scope or with the city. We also request information on any sort of judicial or court proceedings against the vendor in the last 5 years. So certainly we do ask for information where it's relevant on those particular topics. So depending on, the nature of the work that's being requested, we do ask for information on qualifications and other background information on the business that would be relevant to the decision-making process. And similarly, so that's for professional services contracts. Similarly, we ask for information through a pre-qualification questionnaire on public works contracts that ask for different pieces of information, pretty similar to professional services contracts. So past experience, any sort of judicial adjudicative proceedings. We ask about defaults that they might have had on previous contracts, tax certification. So we do collect a lot of information on the applicant and bidder that we, take into account when we're, making decisions before we award the contract.
And per the council member Quinones Sanchez's previous question, is one of the reviews whether the bidder, the bidding contractor has met previous MWDB requirements in the past?
Yes, so that is part of the decision-making process as well. So we collect information on, not only the participation on that particular contract, but, one of the things we can look at is prior performance as well in meeting those goals. And so that was, especially in procurement with the sort of the passing of best value, that is now something that we can take into account when we're looking at the contractors before we're making the award decision. And it's also something that the procurement department on an ongoing basis, in particular for public works contracts, will take a look at in conjunction with OEO and labor standards, how the contractor met some of those goals, not only around the participation of minority, women, disabled-owned businesses on the contract, but also, the payment of prevailing wage to their contractors and other provisions like that.
When you say can be, is it required to be submitted as part of the review process? Like, how would somebody do it unless it's actually part of the review package?
Yeah, so we do ask for information on the vendors, use of minority, women, disabled-owned businesses. So they are required to submit that as part of their application and their bid.
It's
in
self-reported.
particular, there's ranges. It is self-reported, but OEO does review it for compliance. So, we get the information. OEO will confirm that, what they have stated is accurate and that, their use of subcontractors on this particular contract is accurate.
Okay. And then, could you clarify again, do we specifically require whether a bidding contractor has had any past violations related to taxation or labor standards or employment discrimination or EPA violations? Are those required information for past bidding, for a review process?
Right. So we do ask for the previous 5 years, whether the bidder or applicant had any had defaulted on any city contracts, had any sort of adjudication related to their performance on those contracts. So that could include, tax compliance, which we also check for the contractors. So they have to submit that information as well. In terms of employment discrimination, if there was some sort of proceeding or finding against the company, they do, in the last 5 years, they do have to disclose that. The other thing that I will say that we have access to is Dun & Bradstreet, which we check Dun & Bradstreet is sort of a system that collects a lot of business information on the particular business, including, violations of certain laws, if there's been proceedings against them, defaults, things like that. So we also check that to verify some of the information that the vendor is providing us that we're requiring as part of the application.
And so, just if you could help me, because it would help just to make it very clear. So, any rulings by, say, the Philadelphia Commission on Human Relations or the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission would also be a part or accessible as part of the package of review. Is that correct?
Is T. David on the call? He can probably speak to exactly what the requirement is in the RFP, but I believe if it's a finding of that nature, they do have to disclose it, but I don't know exactly off the top of my head what the language is in the RFP in terms of what is required, but we can also get that information too if we can't answer the question right here, because we do have a series of things that we do request. I just don't know the exact language in the RFP for the requirement.
You're on mute, T. David. We can't hear you. Unmute yourself.
They mute me all the time. I apologize. Good morning, T. David Williams, Deputy Chief Administrative Officer, and I'm the Director of Professional Services Contracts for the City of Philadelphia. So in regard to your question, Council Member, we ask for tax certification information, and we have the vendor provide their tax account information. And then it is clarified that until the vendor has been cleared by the Department of Revenue, they cannot move forward with the contract. So the contracting agency then works with the Department of Revenue to make sure that that information is correct. I'm just going to push through the RFP and grab the additional information. So we ask the vendors to provide any default that they've had within the past 5 years. And that's not just in regard to city contracts. That's any default or any non-compliance that they have had. We ask on a contract. We ask the vendor to provide a statement of financial capacity, talking about their solvency, and we ask them for documentation regarding their financial status. We ask them to disclose any litigation or any administrative proceedings within the past 5 years from the date of the RFP, any judicial proceedings that are material to their business or their financial capability. So, and that includes civil and criminal bankruptcy litigation, debarment or suspension with state, local, federal agencies. And then we ask them for that specific information, the case, the proceeding, the parties, the nature, the status, the disposition. So we do ask them for that information, and then it is a requirement for them to provide those responses. And then as the department reviews the RFP responses, they take that information into consideration. Among the other things that we ask for are references, and when references are checked, they're also asked often about that particular information.
Yeah.
I hope that's helpful.
Mr. Williams, just for clarification, would you say that a ruling out of the Philadelphia Commission on Human Relations that might be pertaining to labor discrimination or racial discrimination would qualify under those guidelines?
So the key word here in what we request is material to the applicant's business or financial capability and material to the subject matter of the RFP. I will defer to the law department to define material, but from my perspective, if you have a significant issue regarding racial discrimination, then that is material, right? If you have one claim, that may or may not be material. It depends on the nature of the claim and the nature of the work that you're doing for the city of Philadelphia. My personal perspective from a professional standpoint is more disclosure rather than less disclosure to allow us to make the determination whether or not that's something that should impact the review and the potential award.
So excuse me, just for a point of information, I want to say to the folks who are on our next panel, because we have some very hard time constraints, here today. Councilwoman Gim, I want to thank you for your very thoughtful questions. And I just want to ask that if there is anything else additional that you will need, if you could put those questions in writing, Councilmember Gim, we will forward those to Stephanie along with T. David and any other member of the administration to get answers to those questions. But the people who are lined up to testify on the panels following this, we have time constraints, and we still have to get to one more council member. So thank you so very much for your understanding, Council Lady.
Yes, I just wanted to thank you, and also just to clarify that, I did want to strike the right balance given the spirit of this legislation and some of the concerns that had preceded that, making sure that the city has the full range of information that's available to them, and that it may not be dependent on like a self-reported determination of whether it's specifically related to finances, but part of disclosure is about having us meet our requirements. And in the spirit of the Walter P. Lomax Transparency Act, that we want to ensure that discrimination, issues of labor standards are as important and equally weighted as taxation and other types of legal issues. So I want to thank the council member for that, and I'll follow up. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Council Member. Chair recognizes Council Member Jones.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for this very important economic development tool. And that's what I call inclusion. It is a way to provide resources to entrepreneurs who employ citizens, who pay taxes, who then get city services. And so we appreciate this effort. I go back to chapter 17500, which was the first of such types of bills that were designed to do inclusion. So because of deference of time, I won't go through that history, but what I will focus and narrow down on is how many and how much contracts are in construction annually in Philadelphia.
I'm having to unmute my, I'm trying to unmute myself on my phone, which is a delay, so I apologize. Is Monique on I think Monique is on. She may be, would you be able to provide that information, Monique, on the public works contract? I don't have the number off the top of my head.
We're going to ask for supply services and equipment as well as professional services, so we can tee that up as well.
Yep.
Okay, I am here. Good morning, Monique Neesmith Joyner, Procurement Commissioner for the City of Philadelphia. I can get the total dollar values for you, but for fiscal 19, there were 117 public works contracts, and for fiscal 20, there were 152 public works contracts. For the SS&E, there were roughly 1,200. We do roughly about 1,200 contracts per year.
So the dollar amounts in those categories. I mean, just total, not individual contracts. So
total, we do about $350 billion in contracts.
How many of them were prime contracts for minorities?
I would need to get that for you. I do have it, but not right in front of me.
How many were prime contracts for women?
I could also get that for you.
Should I assume you don't have it for supply services and equipment and professional services as well?
I do have it. I can pull it up if you would allow me just a moment. Okay. Alrighty, here we are. So for Public Works contracts, grand total. Grand total for fiscal 20 was $305,228,000. That's for fiscal 20.
That's total contracts issued by the city of Philadelphia for public works.
Yes.
What is the percentage that went to minorities?
We have few to no minority primes. I would be able to get you the subcontract data.
I need the chairperson to hear that.
We have few to no minority primes for public works.
What is the percentage of participation as subcontractors?
Specifically for minorities?
Yes. The minorities can be anyone from Southeast Asian to African American to Latino. That's a broad definition.
Yes. Specifically for minorities, it is about 20%.
20%.
Women-owned businesses is higher, and that is the women-owned businesses is what drives the MWDSB participation for public works contracting.
So we're going to assume those numbers are good because we could go into what is called pass-throughs. I won't bore the committee with what they are, but how many people were found in non-compliance of participation, and what were the penalties for that non-compliance last year?
For public works or for contracts in general?
And let's go in general.
In general, I would need to defer to T. David.
So the question on the floor, Madam Chair, is out of all of those contracts, how many people were found that did not do what they said they were going to do on the paperwork and found non-compliant in all of our contracting? How many cases?
Yep. We would need to couple together between T. David for professional services and myself for procurement, SS&E, public works to develop that number for you, that total number.
So,
And I think
Council member,
I'm sorry.
do you
Council
have the
member.
number today?
Do I have the number? Not right in front of me, no. But I do have data.
No, I think
To your
yeah,
recollection.
we can work with OEO to get the
Right.
information.
To your recollection, has anyone been disbarred last year for non-compliance?
We did the bar, yes,
How many?
3.
And for what kinds of contracts, if you recall?
We debarred 3 vendors for public works contracting.
All right. So my point to you is that, and I'll end on this. Every law that has ever been written is bedrocked on one thing: monitoring and making sure that people comply. If you have 3 contracts that you debarred out of 17, was it 100 in supply
17.
Supply services and equipment, and then thousands more in SSE, we're probably missing a few.
Mm-hmm.
So in order for your intentions, Madam Chair, as sponsor of this bill to come through, you have to spend your time also equally on enforcement. They have boots on the ground, checking construction sites, boots in warehouses, making sure that supply chains issues are true, and in professional services, that people who are earmarked on contracts that are alleged to have opportunities actually get them. And until we smack a few people in the pockets, people don't take us serious. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Member Jones, for your response. And Member Jones, one of the reasons, and this legislation has literally been about 3 years in the making. With a huge shout out to the law department, Pratt, Lewis, and Raynell for all of their work along with the stakeholders. But we also know that you can't count what you can't measure, and all of the data that we've been collecting in the city of Philadelphia, to be quite frank, it's been housed in places that we as insiders can get access to it. Never have we made this data readily available for the public to access, so that independent policy and research or organizations that are doing work can actually have a place to go to where the data is readily available, and taxpayers get a chance to see. And sort of, if it were a car, I would say look under the hood to actually see who these firms are who are benefiting from doing business and building wealth. And to date, we haven't had access to that opportunity. So I want to be very clear. This is about, I don't want to say weaponizing transparency, but it's empowering the tool of transparency. And Stephanie, I'm going to ask you to I'm going to ask.
Just on your point.
Yes.
As a former director of a program, Minority Business Enterprise Council, you'll find that even within those good numbers for minorities and females, some of the minority companies, if you contact them, won't even know they were named. That's why we have to check. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Agreed. Stephanie, I'm going to ask you to add your point of clarification after Councilmember Bass asks her question. Chair recognizes Councilmember Bass.
Good morning. I just had a brief question. I wanted to follow up on Councilman Jones's questions. And I noticed that the administration is stating that there were 3 disbarments in the previous year for noncompliance. Is that correct?
Yes.
I can't hear you. Okay. So of those 3, can you tell me how many of those 3 were permanent disbarments, meaning that the city basically said that they were ineligible because of their business practices of doing business with the city in the future?
So I would defer to the law, but I'm fairly sure that our provisions only allow us to debar up to a certain number of years. I think it's either 3 or 5.
That's exactly the point that I wanted to make. Because when we say disbar, I think that most people think that we're saying something that's going to be permanent, that there's going to be some permanence here, that someone has been a bad actor and we are going to punish them appropriately, that they have misused taxpayer dollars by saying that they were going to hire people that they did not hire or do things that they did not do. And as a result, the expectation when we say that someone has been disbarred means that that they're out, essentially. They're out. We're not dealing business because you haven't done business in good faith with the city of Philadelphia. And the reason I wanted to make that point is because I wanted to make sure that people understood that when you say that 3 organizations, businesses, companies were disbarred in the last year, there's a very good chance that by now they're back in terms of being eligible to do business with the city of Philadelphia, that our policies to date have been so flimsy in terms of being able to address bad actors. And this isn't just here and now. I've been on council for 8 years now. This has been a fight that's been going on, long before I got here. We've had black mayors, we've had white mayors, we've had black administrators, we've had white administrators. And for whatever reason, the city just refuses to pull itself together and get these policies right. So I am certainly hopeful that we're able to, with the spirit of transparency, make sure that people understand what's happening, and that out of that, we're able to actually get some of the justice that we deserve with our tax dollars. So that being said, I just wanted to thank you, Madam Chair, for this opportunity to speak and to make sure that people understand that even though we're talking about disbarment, this is not a permanent thing. And sometimes it's a matter of months. Once in a while, it's a matter of a couple of years or maybe 2 or 3 years. But after that, they're back in business with the city as if nothing ever happened. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. And again, I want to note for the record, the power about transparency and what we're talking about here is that the public has never had access to the opportunity to see that information. When we do it, it's not a public pronouncement that we are making to the taxpayers here in the city of Philadelphia. So as we have heard calls for social and economic justice and equity and access to opportunity, we know that we can't get there until we make systemic changes in how we do business. And Philadelphia is saying, if you do business with us, what you look like is now going to be part of the public record. I believe that it will make a firm think twice about how it looks, which is why I'm so very happy that our next panel is up to testify. With that being said, and Stephanie, let me just give you 30 seconds if you can to make your clarification, but we want to get to the second panel.
Sure. The one thing I just did want to mention is, you mentioned tools in our toolbox, and we do have a lot of tools at our disposal when a vendor is not doing what they're supposed to be doing, including debarment, but we also withhold payments. So for example, if someone is not paying prevailing wage, they haven't submitted their certified payroll, we'll withhold payments from the vendor until they get that corrected. We can terminate the contract. We can ask for liquidated damages. And we've entered into settlement agreements with vendors to provide payment to the city when they're not complying with certain provisions of their contract. So, and we can suspend vendors as well for a period of time. So I just want to make it clear that, I think, with the number of debarments being what it is, that is not, I don't believe, fully reflective of the number of sort of things that we do and we continue to do to hold our vendors accountable and hopefully help them course correct in a way that allows us to continue to provide the service and also address the non-compliance. So I just wanted to make that quick.
Can I make a point of information, Madam Chair?
Sure. Chair recognizes Councilmember Bass.
Thank you. I recognize the statement in terms of what some of the other options are, and I would invite the administration to provide those that data in writing in terms of all of these different options that are available to us and what has actually been done. But I know, and I speak first-handedly from what the city can do versus what we actually do are two different things. And far too often, the policies of one set of individuals, whether it comes to contracting, and I'm just going to use an example that's probably going to get me, a little hot water, but that's okay. But when you look at the policy of, I think it was PWRT that submitted a bid for, I forget, for some services to the city of Philadelphia, was the largest minority contract that the city of Philadelphia had, and was booted for providing, I think someone gave them, or they gave a campaign contribution. I believe that's what it was. An executive gave a campaign contribution. Contrast that with the vendor for the voting machines, who had a very similar situation occur and was given a slap on the wrist. One company, a minority company, one company, not a minority company. Very similar situations, two completely different outcomes in terms of the way the city of Philadelphia handled those situations. So again, I just wanted to say what we can do versus what we actually do, two different things. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Council Member. I'm going to ask Rachel if she would call the names of our next panel. And I want to say to our next panel, one, a huge thank you to each of you for your advocacy in this area. All three of you are no Johnny come latelys, and even the other folks who are on the panels that will come after you. But I want to just say thank you to each of you for your work. Rachel, can you please call the names?
Yes, we'll have Harold Epps go first, followed by Lynn Washington, and then Keith Leapart.
Thank you. Please state your name for the record and proceed with your testimony. You are on mute, Mr. Thank you, Mr. Epps.
I see that. Yes. Good morning. Good morning. I thought that when I left my post as Commerce Director, I would be leaving, coming before council, but I see that's not the case. So it's a pleasure to be back with you. And so good morning to Council Member Parker and the rest of the Committee of Law and Commerce. I think I know most of you, but let me just state for the record that I had the privilege of serving in the first administration as the Commerce Director. Prior to that, Council Member Bass just referenced the company that I served as CEO and President for 8 years, PRWT U.S. Facilities. And I presently serve as Senior Advisor for Economic Development at Bellevue Strategies. And so it's with all those three roles that I think for myself that I have been a stalwart advocate and supporter of local and minority-owned businesses, in particular those who are most disadvantaged and maligned and challenged, and those are our Black and brown suppliers. Make there be no mistake about that. And so as a result of that and the conversations I've had with Councilmember Parker during my term and post my term, I am in complete support of the Dr. Walter P. Lomax Jr. Transparency in Business Act. Anything that we can do to provide additional trust, accountability, and transparency in the city of Philadelphia, which we all know is a minority city, is sorely needed, particularly again for our Black and brown businesses, because the deck is stacked against them in every shape and form possible. I am old enough to be a civil rights and affirmative action baby, and I'm struck by the fact that over the last 40 years, America has done everything possible to dismantle all the aspects of affirmative action, and a lot of that is what leads us to this place. I will share one little area of frustration in my 4 years about what some of my private sector practices that I wanted to do always fallen on the comment, we can't do that because the law won't allow. And so again, Council Member, I really applaud you and the rest of the committee to bring this forward, because we need to do this and even more to try to just begin to chip away as the plights and disadvantages that our minority, particularly Black and brown suppliers, face. So I'll stop there and say that I'm supposed to be on another call right now leading a conversation about this very subject in the private sector, but thought this so important that I will close that meeting and stay with you for the next whatever I need to be to answer any questions that you may have. So thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much, Mr. Epps. I want to say thank you, and we need you to stay on for these questions because there are several questions that we have. Mr. Washington?
Hello.
Hello. Good morning, Mr. Washington. Please state your name for the record and proceed with your testimony.
Good morning, Madam Chair, Mr. Vice Chair, and members of the Law and Government Committee. My name is Lynn Washington, Jr. I'm a journalism professor at Temple University. I'm also a veteran reporter in this city. It is my pleasure to testify in support of this package of legislation. As a reporter, I've covered city council proceedings since the mid-'70s, countless of them. This is the first time that I've testified before this distinguished body. I'm here to testify about a contentious and yes, contemptible issue, and that is the systemic exclusion of economic opportunities, and that exclusion adversely impacts African Americans and other persons of color in this city. These inequities, this systemic exclusion, have lasted for far, far too long. And as a reporter, I have been before City Council doing coverage too many times, hearing poignant pleas from persons asking for action to end this race-based exclusion. These testimonies have emphasized the fact that systemic inequities drive the widespread impoverishment crippling this city. In 2001, 19 years ago, a member of City Council issued a report, and that report was entitled The Illusion of Inclusion. In that report, it was noted that in 1998, non-minority firms received 90% of the $317 million that the city of Philadelphia spent on contracts for services, supplies, equipment, and public works. The author of that report, then Councilman Angel Ortiz, noted that efforts to end and ameliorate these inequities have been hindered by bias and bigotry and by persons in power who profess to be supportive of racial diversity, yet who use any measures to make equality impossible to achieve. 19 years before the issuance of that report, City Council approved legislation that sought to improve the level of contracts received by the minorities and women in this city. It noted that in the 3 fiscal years before passage of that legislation in 1982, of the nearly $876 million in contracts, minorities received 0.09% Yes, you heard me correctly. Minority firms receive far less than 1% of the nearly $750 million in city contracts. And I want to add, or just let me go back to that observation of then Councilman Ortiz about persons who profess support for diversity but work against it. I was a reporter for the Daily News at the time. I covered City Council. I wrote a report using the figures that we received from the city's procurement department about these 0.09%. The then administration of Bill Green, the mayor, came to the Daily News office screaming and yelling that those figures were inaccurate. They said, we will provide the correct figures because they are a lot larger. About a day later, they came up with about 5 pages, handwritten notes, and those figures totaled 0.18%. It should have been embarrassing to the mayor, but it wasn't. Now, let me just give a little history and then I'll conclude, because this history of economic exclusion makes mockery of the city's motto of the city of brotherly love. In 1789, Black shop owners were hindered from expanding because they couldn't borrow any money. And as we see today in private business lending and also in redlining of mortgages, those sort of problems remain. We all are familiar with this seminal study that was done in 1899, The Philadelphia Negro, by W.E.B. Du Bois. He stated that prejudice and poverty hindered the, quote, economic rise of Black Philadelphia. And he was very critical of the fact that the doors that were open to other races were slammed shut on minorities. And I might add, in 1834, whites rioted in the city of Philadelphia. There were a lot of riots, race riots in the city of Philadelphia that attacked and burned Black businesses, Black churches, and homes. In that 1834 riot, there was a demand that Blacks be excluded from certain jobs in the city of Philadelphia. Lesser known than Du Bois's report is the follow-up report that was published in 1912. And that report also documented that racism and a lack of capital were the chief handicaps for Black economic advancement in Philadelphia. The person who wrote that report was a person who received a PhD in economics from the University of Pennsylvania, a successful banker and a bishop named Richard R. Wright Jr. And he said this: it is for an opportunity to be part of an industrial democracy that Negroes plead, an opportunity to just make the best living possible. We're tired of pleading and begging for opportunities that are nominally extended to so many others. Yet we remain resolute in sustaining efforts to end this economic inequality. I want to end with something that was also mentioned by Councilman Ortiz in his illusion of inclusion report. He said it behooves the city to do all it can to ameliorate the racial and gender disparities that exist in the city and the city's procurement process and construction industry. Yes, this Transparency in Business Act is an innovative approach to addressing the matrix of economic inequalities, but it is also just good business practice because it promotes openness in government, and that openness in government is what citizens demand. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Washington, and we're going to ask you to stay on as well because I know there are going to be multiple questions for this panel, so please stay with us, Mr. Washington. Mr. Leapart.
About that, trying to unmute here. First and foremost, thank you, Councilwoman Parker, for inviting me here, or Chairwoman Partner for inviting me here, as well as Vice Chairman Green. I've really enjoyed this discussion and you bringing this to the table. I have to say I'm proud of all of you for being so direct and challenging people in power to really provide a level of transparency around something that we know that is dragging down our city, right? We often complain about, the poverty in the city of Philadelphia, but we never really try to be intentional or haven't been intentional about true solutions. And I think this is truly a great first step. And so, I, as Harold F. said, as Mr. Washington said, I am also in complete support of the Dr. Walter P. Lomax Jr. Transparency in Business Act. And for me, this is somewhat personal because as a young physician coming up in the city of Philadelphia, Dr. Lomax was everything that I aspired to become. He was a successful physician, a businessman, a philanthropist, and a family man. And he would often say to me when we talked that he was unapologetically Black, right? Which he often displayed in his willingness to advocate for and inspire future leaders. And so for me, his life was a true reflection of the saying, you can't be what you can't see. I saw Dr. Lomax and realized what I could be, that I just didn't have to be a physician, that I could be a business leader, I could be a philanthropist, I could be all these things. And so, I learned about his humble beginnings in South Philadelphia. So I think this is a great honor to his legacy and definitely proud to be here today. Some critics may say that this bill and bills like this are unnecessary and will achieve little. But I would argue bills like these are critical steps in ensuring that contractors and vendors and suppliers in our city begin to think about the composition of their workforce when pursuing city contracts, right? This is the majority-minority city, and we have deep, deep poverty in the city, but minorities have been unable to participate in past economic growth. And we're at a moment here where, soon there will probably be some level of dollars flowing to the city, potentially around infrastructure and construction. And we need to make sure that systems are in place to make sure that inclusion is on the forefront of all contractors. This bill solves all the problems we face in addressing the deep poverty and lack of inclusion in our business community? No. But at least it will provide greater transparency into the challenges we face in identifying this inclusion gap. And I think we all can agree that representation matters. And I would argue that the reason why city council has the potential to be really effective is because they are representative of our city, right? There's diversity in city council. And I'll often say that, our problems as a community are not political, they're economic, right? We have great representation, but we have been unable to crack the economic nut here in the city of Philadelphia, right? And so representation matters on city council. It also matters in our business community and how we spend city tax revenue. So we agree that representation matters and that we can't be what we can't see. Then we need to make sure that Philadelphia residents are in position to model behaviors that we want them to follow. I can speak personally to, modeling behaviors and wanting to be like Bruce Crawley, who was on a panel before, growing up and being a young person in the city, being inspired that he was a vocal advocate for Black businesses in the city and sitting in his office, as a young person and saying, you know, I want to be like you. I want to be in the position that you are years from now, right? And for me, once again, we need people and our young people and minorities in the city to see that they can be a part of this economy, right? We often, once again, lament about being the poorest big city in the country. We need to make sure that we're intentional about encouraging our city vendors and contractors to hire, develop, and train Philadelphia residents. And I have to say, you know, for me as a business owner, minority business owner, and we all know that, you know, minority businesses are more likely to hire minority candidates. And I can speak from experience that as a minority business owner, I've been, unfortunately, that business that was named on a contract with the city, but never saw one dime as a sub. I have been that multiple times. The list would come out, and I have a printing company, a graphic design company, marketing company, and I would get the calls and spend my time going through the process of bidding on a contract. The contract is awarded. We never see one dime of it. So, you know, that is something that is true. And at this point, I will not even participate unless I'm the prime. I won't even take the call and be the sub because I've been, you know, screwed over so many times with that. So, minority businesses, you know, we have to be intentional and making sure that they're at the table. I know for me, at the end of the year, as a business owner in my business, I reach out directly to the principal at Dobbins High School. And the first question I ask them is, say, who are your best students who are in your printing and graphic design program who are not heading to college? And the principal or the department head will send me some leads, and we hire those people, right? And I'm not hiring those people, and I'm hiring those people for a reason. One, because I want to make sure that young people, there are paths outside of, you know, hanging out on the streets and, you know, and outside of actually even going to college directly, right? Learning a skill, learning a trade, and have the ability to model the behavior that they see with me every day as a business owner. And for me to be able to invest my time in them. And so, you know, this is something that we talk about, it's systemic. The challenges here, and let's be clear, as a Black business owner, as a young person in the city, I do not feel like my star is brightest here. I've had plenty of friends who have come up, who are my age, who have decided that this is not the place to be if you are a minority business owner, and have taken their businesses and moved to other cities. We should be ashamed of that because we've seen these historic numbers of just lack of inclusion, all these different barriers, all these reasons why we can't get Black businesses or minority businesses to the table, but we create a culture where they don't even feel welcome and they literally pack up their bags and go to other markets. We need to create, and for me, this is the first step. This is not the only step, but this is the first step. And I think starting looking at the city first and saying, hey, who are we contracting with? What's the demographic of the people that are in these companies is really important. And then I'll say after this, I think this is the type of transparency that we need from our larger nonprofit institutions who, as we know, have not, who don't pay, in my opinion, their share of taxes and contribute to the tax base there. We need to see where their dollars are going as well. So this, once again, Councilwoman Parker, this is a great first step, and I applaud you in your leadership for bringing this to the floor today.
Again, thank you all so very much for your testimony. I know my colleagues are going to have questions, so thank the three of you for agreeing to stick around. The first question that I have is for Mr. Washington. Mr. Washington, I want to go back to that anecdote that you shared about that story you wrote, sort of quantifying the percentage of business being done in the city of Philadelphia that was actually awarded to minority businesses. I want you to help me, if you will, tell me what how difficult would it have been, or how much easier for you as an external figure in the journalism world to write your story if that information was instead public, where you could literally get it on the city's website versus it being housed in someone's office?
Well, openness in government is always good for the public, and it's particularly good for reporters. If I could just, that was in the pre-internet days too, so let's be clear. If I could just go online and click on something and read through some reports, not just the executive summary, but read through all the reports, that would be helpful. And it would also be very easy to, quite frankly, shut down these bogus arguments that we're doing so well. And then you come up and tell me that we've doubled what you reported on, but you're still reporting a figure that should cause you shame to even bring it up. 18/100%. And then when you really looked at it, they were, which I did, they fudged numbers along the way to incrementally increase certain areas to come up with that 18/100s to refute the figures that city council members that were then sources of mine provided in the report that they utilized to create that bill. And I also want to just add that bill that came out in 1982 was a result of about 2 years of efforts. City council members tried to make some initiatives to make those changes. The then administration kept promising that they would make the changes. When they didn't, council pushed forward with it. And when they passed the bill and passed it over the veto of the mayor had the audacity to go to Progress Plaza and criticize city council as the worst in the free world because they tried to empower a large segment of the population of the city, taxpayers, who have been systemically excluded from the time before the formal founding of the city of Philadelphia.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Washington. Mr. Epps, let me ask this question of you, Mr. Epps. One of the things we were very conscious of when developing this legislation that's actually been in the works for a few years now was we were very conscious of the quota issue. We were conscious of making sure we drafted something that could stand to any sort of legal muster regarding this legislation that's being proffered. With that being said, I want you to tell me, from your experience being in government and both in the private sector, tell me about the private sector and the report card, because I want you to know that was when you first started and I first got here to council. That's when I first learned about that work. You were in the private sector. And tell me, where is that report card status, and that is sort of a voluntary effort from the business community?
So for backdrop, 10 years ago, and I want to give credit where credit was due, Pat Coulter and I was on the board of the Urban League at that time, with help from George Burrell and others, Bob Bogle and others. We developed a 5-pronged report card. Nobody should be surprised by the categories. They are the composition of your board, the composition of your C-suite, your employment in general, your procurement results, and your philanthropic giving. And we asked the members of the Chamber of Commerce to voluntarily self-assess themselves and report back on their status in those 5 categories. And the little motto was, and by the way, we use demographic data to then report out and quantify your performance using the stoplight: green, above average, yellow, average, and red, below average, and self-assess, and if you had red, to get the red out. This is 10 years ago. And of the 180 assessments that went out, we got a 33% response. So the conclusion that we reached, at least I reached, was 2. Like Mr. Washington, many of them were embarrassed, so they had no regard for it and chose not to respond. Or they just didn't give a you-know-what. And by the way, I am still involved with the Chamber pushing and prodding and navigating for progress. It is slow, but you get a little crumb here and now and then, but nowhere near the kind of pace that if we were serious. And what I found in my 4 years as commerce director, I've got 30 some odd years in the private sector, 4 in government, and that is we hide behind, Councilmember Bass talked about, we do as little as we have to do. And then we hide behind laws and policies and rules to do what we say we don't want to do. And so my dear friend Keith Leppard talked about intentionality. We're nowhere near as intentional as we need to be, we should be, we can be, and we must be. And we protect ourselves by saying the law won't allow it. And one of the things that frustrated me more was the inability to disaggregate data to get down to where we had the most pain, and that is without black and brown suppliers, because the law wouldn't allow us. And as a result of this continued expansion of the rules of diversity and inclusion, everybody benefits from the people that was originally designed for, and that was black and brown. Quite frankly, it was designed for black folk. And we are now at the very back of the bus, if you will, use that metaphor, because everyone else now is benefiting from what was intended for the people who were most disadvantaged over decades and centuries in this country, and that's black folk.
Finally, this is my last question, and I'm going to ask each of you if you could just give a response to this. One of the issues that I've heard as I've had community meetings and stakeholder meetings with residents, to be quite frank, from neighborhoods throughout the city, is that when you heard me in my opening testimony talk about the embrace and the diversity of the constituencies, saying that they believe that Black Lives Matter. I'm talking about those folks who have willingly, joined with the Black Lives Matter movement, those folks who have been calling for an end to the misuse of abuse of power in the police department, to reforming the police department. Do you think there is a reason why there has appeared to be so much willingness to advocate and affirm that all folks believe that Black Lives Matter when it comes to reforming the police department, but we have not heard so much of that kind of argument when it comes to, equity and economic opportunity? And I want to hear from each of you, and I would like to start with Mr. Leapart.
So I would say that for the most part, we haven't gotten to a point where most people equate economic inequality with racism, right? I think there is, we can see racism in George Floyd. We can see racism in police brutality, but we have not gotten to a place where most people, and I'll say, majority or white people can get to the point that they can say, really relate income inequality and economic inequality with racism and systemic racism over the years. And until we can get to that point that people can accept that, that part of the reason why they are where they are and maybe have had a head start in life is not because of anything that they've done, it's because of the color of their skin, and that they have been able to get to the front of the line because of practices and procedures over the years that allow for them to continue to ascend. White women, as Harold said, have become the beacon for for diversity, right? But oftentimes, of course, married to a white man who has already benefited from his position in life, right? And as a Black business owner, we are held, often compared or lumped in together around, just generic diversity, and that truly needs to be disaggregated. It has to be disaggregated for us to move neither. So I see people saying it and saying, yes, it's easy to say Black Lives Matter, but more importantly, from an economic perspective, they haven't come to the realization that some of the things that they achieved in life is based on the head start they get based on the color of their skin.
Thank you, Mr. Washington.
I would just endorse what Mr. Leapert said, that there is this lack of understanding of the connection between these systemic exclusion from economic opportunities and the realities of racism. I heard a comment yesterday that said, when you're privileged, the least amount of equality is perceived as oppression. So when you talk about sharing the economic pie, that becomes un-American because we haven't done that for so long. And at some point, we just have to have some frank talk. Ignorance at some point is inexcusable. And the fact that we as Americans don't really understand our history, and particularly here in Philadelphia, where history pretty much started in terms of democracy. In 1799, a group of 75 Black Philadelphians, and included a lot of business people, went to Congress and asked them for the gradual abolition of slavery. Congress denied that. These Black people said that we will help our enslaved brethren. It was ignored. They also asked for an end to abuses of the Fugitive Slave Act. If that matter had been resolved in 1799, we wouldn't be here talking about this legislation that is so much needed.
Thank you, Mr. Epps.
So just to make a couple of quotes. Recently, I read someplace where the headline was "Greed is good until it's bad," and that's where we find ourselves. I don't think there's any misunderstanding or miscomprehension of what is happening in this country, but we're talking about Philadelphia in the city. And I think one of the unique things about our city, when it comes with economic participation, gets back to the reality that over the last 50 years, the pie has shrunk. Mm-hmm. Okay, the city has gotten smaller, and technology has taken a lot of the labor components out of the conversation, and nobody gives up power or position without a fight. And what we find ourselves having been locked out for centuries is there is no willingness, and it's systematic, it's institutionalized to protect the status quo because the pie is shrinking, at least in people's eyes. And those, just like in employment, last in, first out, we're still fighting to get any part of the city at the table. Using Thanksgiving as a metaphor, in my household, that was the adult table and the kiddie table. Well, with us, we're still trying to get any seat at the adult table.
Last, Mr. Epps and Lee Park, what is your response to anyone in the private sector who would say that, making this information public and transparent is just another onerous requirement for business, and, the city of Philadelphia, thinking that it could become a model, in transparency and demonstrating how we should do business, is not going to encourage anyone in the private sector to change. What's your response to that? And the two business, both of you, because you're in business.
I actually think you summed it up earlier when you stated that minority businesses have to register, we have to certify, we have to provide all this additional information to even get on those bidding lists that are used for majority businesses to kind of, tack, when we want to create a relationship just to bid on a contract, and then we get nothing, right? So we already are taking steps. As a minority business, there's an extra burden to even get in position to get to that table Harold is talking about, right? So for me, providing this transparency is the least that people can do. I don't think this is cumbersome at all.
Thank you, Mr. Epps.
Keith and I think like on everything that I know of, and this is one of those cases. And I would say the other part of this is government. So I see my friend Will Carter from the chamber on this call, and he came out of council. And so often the chamber uses the statement, it believes in free enterprise. Well, history proves that left unchecked, free enterprise will abuse employees and keep Black folk out. That's all right. That's why we have unions. And one of the responsibilities of council and government is to put entities in check that are out of balance. And so I would say to them, and I'm one of them because I'm in business, is this is only a response to what has not occurred in our history. So if you had done what you were supposed to do, we wouldn't need this. This is a response to what we have not done. And history says even with it, we will have to fight, scrape, and, continue to try to climb a hill that, again, is Keith is right. And I ran PRWT for 7 years and ran white organizations before, and I know the difference. We need this and more to just even have a fighting chance to begin to rebalance the equation.
I want to thank you all so very much for your testimony, and I don't see any questions in the chat box for this committee, but any final questions for this panel? Gentlemen, I want to thank you so very much for your testimony. If any other questions come up that are specifically geared to you and you are no longer on the call, we will just forward them to you and ask that you would forward the answers back to the committee so that we can have it included in our notes of testimony that will be distributed to all members of council. So thank you so very much.
Council member, my understanding is keep up the good fight.
Thank you.
Amen.
Thank you, Mr. Epps in Washington and Lee Park. Rachel, will you please call the names of the next panel?
Will Carter, Stephen Bradley, and Nick Shenoy.
Thank you all so very much for your testimony. For being here today. Before you proceed with your testimony, make sure you state your name for the record. And this is going to be our order. Will Carter, Stephen Bradley, and Nick Shenoy. Will Carter, Steve Bradley, and Nick Shenoy in that order. Thank you so much for being here.
All right, Councilwoman, how are you doing? Good morning, Chairwoman Parker and the members of the Committee on Law and Government. I'm William Carter, Vice President of Local Government Affairs for the Chamber of Commerce of Greater Philadelphia. Thank you for allowing me to testify today on the Walter P. Lomax Jr. Transparency in Business Act. The need to increase diversity in contracting and workforce in Philadelphia is key to the future of our city. I thank Councilwoman Parker, who has worked long and hard, both in Harrisburg and City Council, to eliminate disparities that exist in our city regarding access to opportunity. The global pandemic, combined with calls for social justice, presented the most recent opportunity for the region's public and private sectors to work in concert to implement positive economic change for all. To that point, the Chamber of Commerce, in collaboration with the City of Philadelphia, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, the 4 other southeastern Pennsylvania counties, and over 160 business and civic leaders launched the Philadelphia Recharge and Recovery Task Force. After weeks of intense meetings of diverse stakeholders, the task force made 6 primary recommendations. Of those 6 was the need to ensure the growth of Black and brown and locally owned businesses, as well as upskill local residents for the current job demand. Following the September announcement of these initial recommendations, we began to work to build platforms to ensure the actualization of these recommendations. Currently, we're working with Accenture to finalize a mechanism with which to upskill an initial 4,000 Philadelphians for the talent demands of local employers. And we are also finalizing an agreement with an organization to build a platform to increase private sector utilization of Black and brown owned businesses. We thank all of our stakeholders for working with us to ensure the successful outcome of these efforts. We appreciate, once again, Councilwoman Parker introducing this transparency of business legislative package. We support the legislation as the proposals will allow the city to assess where it is in terms of their local and Black and brown procurement spend. We also appreciate the Councilwoman's engagement with us weeks ago in this regard and her staff in continued conversations to improve the legislation in some areas. Per our conversations, we're supportive of the bills with some amendments, which we believe are reasonable and help the intent of the legislation. The first of which is, per our conversation with the sponsor, sponsor's office and the Miller Group, the amendment allows for a next steps by ensuring that the disclosures called for are shared with organizations that can move the needle forward in terms of helping majority-owned firms improve their diversity spend and in helping minority firms develop capacity. This can also be an example of the kind of public-private partnership that so many have indicated is crucial to inclusive business growth in Philadelphia. The second is making the procurement department the responsible agency. As the code already references the procurement department in these sections, it may follow that this department is best suited for matters of this nature. Also, making this department a responsible agency can help to allay concerns some businesses may have about disclosing this information, as it will be stewarded by a department sensitive to the nature of such business disclosures. And the last, the proposed removal of the salary range disclosure. This particular disclosure is the most sensitive for those called for in this bill. Many salary decisions are based on varying level of experience and skill sets, which make for an apples and oranges, dollar and cents comparison, even for people with similar jobs. Disclosures in this area could not only spark issues amongst employees, but also cause consternation between employees and business owners who base what they pay their employees on a variety of factors that may not be in uniformity with their competition. In closing, we look forward to continued collaboration with the public sector to advance policies that align with our Recharge and Recovery Task Force recommendation, especially as it relates to creating more procurement opportunities for Black and brown businesses. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Carter, for your testimony. Mr. Bradley, if you would just state your name for the record and proceed with your testimony.
Sure. Good morning. My name is Stephen Scott Bradley, Chairman of the African American Chamber of Commerce. I speak on behalf of the board and the members of the African American Chamber of Commerce that's been around for over 27 years in support of amendments to Chapter 17-100 of the Philadelphia Code. We are strong supporters of the transparency, though I believe it's the Walter P. Lomax Jr. Transparency and Business Legislation Package. Despite the Chamber's hard work over 27 years, more work must be done to increase supplier diversity opportunities among Philadelphia local businesses. However, before local government can demand private companies to diversify their spend by hiring local businesses, it must first diversify its own spending. That said, Walter P. Lomax Jr. Transparency and Business Legislation Package will help the city of Philadelphia do just that. Accordingly, the African American Chamber of Commerce fully supports the Walter P. Lomax Jr. Transparency and Business Legislative Package, and we thank Councilwoman Sherelle Parker for her leadership and for her stand on top of making sure there's equity in the business community in the region. Thank you for your support, and if you have any questions, feel free to entertain them. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bradley. Mr. Shenoy, please state your name for the record and proceed with your testimony. I see you now, Nick.
Thank you, Councilwoman Parker. Thank you for inviting me. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you well, Nick.
Thank you. My name is Narasimha Shenoy, also known as Nick Shenoy, and I am the founder, president, and CEO of the Asian American Chamber of Commerce of Greater Philadelphia. We are a membership nonprofit organization that serves Asian businesses, individual entrepreneurs, and nonprofit organizations for the growth of economy and employment in the Greater Philadelphia area. Majority of Asian business owners in Philadelphia are immigrants, came to seek better life and to pursue American dream. Those who are not educated, culturally different, and face language barriers are in business for their survival. It is our mission to help such businesses to survive and grow, to help themselves to create jobs for others. Asian community poverty level in Philadelphia is around 23%. First step to increasing job growth and reducing the city poverty rate is making it easier for entrepreneurs to start a business and create employment in their neighborhood. Starting and running a business is hard enough and should not be made harder by burdensome legislations. I have been an advocate of equal opportunity for minority businesses for many years, beginning from then Mayor Ed Rendell administration. I've also worked with the city as a contractor for many years. Doing so, I have personal experience in contracting practices of crime and challenges of minority subcontractors face. Our chamber does support any council initiative to provide equal opportunity to diverse businesses doing business with the city. Although minority certification is essential to identify diverse businesses to prevent misuse, it is also it alone is not enough to promote diversity in the city procurement. We have seen studies after studies which points out that we do need additional measures to move forward to provide opportunity for Black and Brown owned businesses. We are supportive of this legislation, which requires contractors to provide diversity-related data on resources working on the city projects to identify their effort in promoting diversity in their workforce. However, I do have some concern regarding the burdening all businesses with the data requirements and disclosing information critical to maintaining privacy of business owners and employees, whether such businesses owned by minority or non-minorities. It is my understanding that Commerce Department sets goal of MBE to certain level based on the availability of subcontractors. To increase the goals of higher level, there needs to be more MBE startup, especially in the skilled trade. City needs to provide incentive to promote minority businesses to start and grow to increase the pool of contractor and suppliers. Thank you, Councilwoman Parker and committee members, for giving us an opportunity to testify on behalf of AACCGP. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Nick, and to all of you on this panel for your participation. Listen, my first, it's not even a question, it's really a comment. Will, from the Chamber of Commerce, Mr. Will Carter, I want to thank you for your testimony and for just noting for the record that this could be a kind of public-private partnership that so many have noted could be crucial to developing and further enhancing an inclusive business growth in Philadelphia. And in your testimony or in the proposed amendments that you offer, you mention a list of organizations: PIDC, the Enterprise Center, Urban Affairs Coalition, the Chamber, African American Chamber, Hispanic Chamber, Asian Chamber, University City, Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission, and the Urban League. And so for that, I just want to state to you that I'm totally on board with working with the Chamber of Commerce. We will be reviewing all of the proposed amendments. I also appreciate you noting for the record that we have already had prior conversations about this. And I'm happy that you are thinking about next steps, because next steps versus saying this is not something when we can support. I'm thinking about Mr. Epps' testimony from the previous panel when he talked about working with Pat, who was formerly at the Urban League, Pat Coulter and George Burrell, and out of 180 or businesses, only 33% responded. And one of the things that he said that I really took to heart is that when we first start beginning to collect this data, some of it's not going to be pretty, right? Because there are firms who are not where they should be. And Mr. Epps said that, they knew that some firms would literally be embarrassed. But the idea that there are organizations and places that they can go that could help them, find, access to not credible and just prepared, but access to the opportunity to collect with other minority-owned businesses so that they can change those numbers. So the fact that that's something that you guys are interested in, that's extremely important to me. And again, I wanted to state that for the record. I now want to acknowledge Councilman Jones for a question. Councilmember Jones.
I just want to thank the panelists that have testified for their various insights from experiences in the private sector to reshaping the notions of the private sector, particularly you, Will, over at the Chamber of Commerce, and helping to bridge the gap between the public sector, which is us, and the private sector, which is made up of tax-paying businesses, to create commonality, to create common understanding. And what you said, Madam Chair, is brilliant. No, it isn't always going to be pretty. But I remember going to get my physical, and my doctor told me I was slightly overweight, and that my blood pressure was a little high, that my sugar might needed a little work. And all of that was embarrassing. But over the long term, it helps you get better. It helps you get healthy. And so these are important, uncomfortable conversations that we must have. So I wanted to thank your panelists for their input.
Thank you. And Councilmember Jones, when I hear you talk sometimes, especially when it's the Committee on Economic Development or on the legislation before us today, I have a flashback of you and your prior days, right? When you were over at PCDC actually doing this work. So I want to thank you for that. I also want to just note for the record, for those who have said, again, why is the transparency important? And doggone it, why does it have to be on the city's website? You can't count what you don't measure, right? Or you can't measure what you don't count, right? You have to have access to the data. And I'm thinking about that because I'm thinking about Keith Leapard's comment that you can't be what you don't see. Right, so those two go hand in hand, and I want to thank this panel for their testimony. If there are no more questions for this panel, I don't see any requests in the chat box. I want to thank each and every one of you for your testimony. If another question comes up for you when we get on the next panel and you're no longer on, just please note for the record that we'll send you the question and you can just respond to us in writing, and then we can give it to the stenographer to make it a part of the public record for this hearing. But we want to thank each of you for your participation. We're going to ask. Thank you. I'm going to ask Rachel, our clerk, would you please call the next panel?
Kendra Moore, Bruce Crawley, Allison Cohen, Reverend Marshall Mitchell, and Rita Hill, Esquire.
We want to thank you all so very much for your testimony. And just because of time, we have to make some minor adjustments to the order. Pastor Reverend Marshall Mitchell from Salem, we are going to close with you. We want you to close this panel, and we're going to ask Bruce Crawley. Bruce, are you on?
Now I'm on.
Oh, okay. Thank you. With Mr. Crawley, we are going to ask you. So the order will be first, Mr. Crawley, second, Allison Cohen, third, Rita Hill, fourth, Kendra Moore, and Reverend Marshall Mitchell from Salem Baptist Church will close this panel. Mr. Crawley, can you please state your name for the record and proceed with your testimony?
I am A. Bruce Crawley. I'm CEO of Millennium 3 Management, a communications firm in Center City, Philadelphia.
Thank you, Mr. Crawley. Please proceed.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And I guess Derek Green, Vice Chair, is now gone. See Curtis sitting there in the center. Want to recognize him and thank him also for the good work that's been done on this issue. I'll start by saying that even with so much else going on here in Philadelphia, even in this time of national political turmoil and confusion, even in the midst of a global health crisis called the coronavirus, I'm proud to have been invited by this council today to weigh in on a very timely and critical bill. The very appropriately named Walter P. Lomax Jr. Transparency in Business Act is a proposed piece of legislation that has the potential to lead us to uncover longstanding economic disparities that have plagued our city and our nation since at least 1619. Those disparities have clearly provided a substantial economic advantage to white segments of our population, while at the same time producing substantial disadvantage to businesses and households headed by Blacks, Hispanics, and other people of color. I would like to believe that if our recently certified president-elect were here, Mr. Biden would agree that the time has come to eliminate these economic disparities and to work together on a bipartisan and racially inclusive basis to build a better Philadelphia. To arrive at that goal, of course, it will require that we begin by addressing in a quantifiable way. And that's what I like about what this bill stipulates. It quantifies what the problem is in a way that we haven't seen before. The lingering attitudes and negative economic outcomes from our nation's original sin and its undying obsession with systemic racism. It has undeniably been the elephant in the room at virtually every discussion held in this country, from housing issues to healthcare, to the allocation of educational resources, to jobs and job training, from entry level to top executive employment decisions, and to the selection of board members in companies where such things are required. We'd have to be naive or blind to believe that systemic racism has not provided guidance for business financing decisions and for contracts that are won for every business that supports our economy. Can any bankers or chief procurement officers on the line today honestly deny the truth of that statement, simply based on which businesses have obtained the most suitable financing and which bidders have actually won the most contracts in our city? Why are serious discussions now taking place about diversity and inclusion in some of our nation's most well-appointed boardrooms? Well, it's simply because those directors realize finally that if they don't begin to take definitive steps to ensure that their HR people don't begin to pay appropriate attention, excuse me, I'm being directed.
Thank you.
To begin to take definitive steps to ensure that their HR people don't begin to pay appropriate attention to how systemically racist behaviors have affected their operations, there would be precious few people of color hired in Philadelphia or anywhere else in corporate America. There would continue to be virtually no contracts let to even the most qualified so-called minority-owned businesses and executives. I point out that when I go on, you guys ever go on state and county quick facts, the extracts from the census report, and if you go in there and you look at Philadelphia, they show white population and white businesses, and for the part that I'm looking for, primarily, I'm looking for black businesses. They don't have that. They just have minority businesses. And so even when we try to do research to find out what the percentage of our participation has been, it's been hidden by the Census Bureau itself. And that's the most easily accessible way to get data from the Census Bureau. We need to be concerned about that. This is not everyday sporadic racist behavior. This is rather systemic racism, the kind that has been baked into all that we have ever thought and done in American society. It is the kind of racism that most Philadelphians have taken entirely for granted. As an example of a similar malaise and lack of empathy for people affected by COVID-19 in this country, we've heard a high-ranking federal elected official describe his lack of interest in resolving a major life and death issue as, "It is what it is." In that same attitude, very much different from being aware of disproportionate levels of economic segregation, poverty, underemployment, poor housing, and social desperation in Black and other communities of color. Is it any different from shrugging our collective shoulders and continuing to ignore targeted actions that can improve these shameful economic and social conditions through enlightened new policy? Over more than 350 years of its history, Philadelphia has actually elected Black mayors and Hispanic and Asian council members. Through all of that political evolution, they too have had to address the scourge of lingering economic segregation, and Philadelphia itself has also paid the price. With a rapidly changing population over the past years, we have continued to cultivate unspoken policies of systemic racism, managing and allocating the city's economic resources, very much as we did in 1950. when whites constituted 71.9% of the population and blacks were just 27.9%. And others, the broad category of others, was 0.2. There weren't even enough Hispanics and Asians to be broken out as separate entities. We have followed those outmoded economic policies for so long that our city, which is now 65% comprised of blacks, as compared to 1950 when it was 27.9, Hispanics and Asians, and 35% comprised of whites. And you have to watch the census also. I mean, they'll show you a number for white population, and then you look down at the bottom, and there's another number for white population, and it says non-Hispanic whites. And so they count the Hispanics as Hispanics, and they count the whites, and then they count non-Hispanic whites in a fit of disclosure at the very end. So the reality is there are 44% African Americans in the city of Philadelphia and about 35% whites. This has been clearly a self-inflicted wound. This is clearly a situation we can address for the benefit of the household incomes of all of our residents, for the improvement of our tax collection procedures, and even for the prospect of improved bond ratings and enhanced ability to attract future large employers. For these and other reasons, I was delighted to be asked to testify in support of this bill. In my mind, this is a critical and long overdue first step in the benchmarking of how the proceeds of city contracts should be channeled down to the greater benefit of all of the city's neighborhoods and businesses. The second step, once that data are collected, including also the geographic demographics of the businesses and workforce participants. I'm really concerned I love this whole bill, but I'm concerned about making sure we break out all of the geographics, not just of the workforces, but break out the geographics of the companies themselves. I think a lot of the companies that are taking contracts from Philadelphia are companies that don't reside here. So, we don't want to have a civil war with other cities and counties, but we need to understand the extent to which people are making contract decisions to companies outside our city and not benefiting our local Philadelphia residents who happen to own businesses. That's critically important, and we need to know that too. The second step, once the data are collected, including the geographic demographics and their workforce participants, is when we will begin to see a stronger Philadelphia that no longer refuses to include the economic potential of the vast majority of its own population. And in closing, the other issue that I was concerned about was the lack of any appearance of how the banking institutions would tie into this. If you talk to people who are small business owners, and especially Black small business owners, they will tell you that the number one issue for them is capital and the access to financing. And I don't see any report given out that talks about what percentage of the loans let have gone to people of color, and what kinds of loans and financing are made available as compared to those in the broader community. And so I really like what I've seen. It is a good step in the right direction. But again, the next step is to put it into action. What do we do with the information we've gotten? Do we blend it into all of the components of the RFPs that are going to be let? And then when we build them into the RFPs, how do we weight the participation of those participations? How do we do that? And until we come up with that, I think this is a good first step, but the second step still needs to be done. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your testimony, Mr. Crawley, and we will acknowledge it at the end of this panel. But I've constantly said, for anyone who is thinking, it's an old African proverb that says that there is nothing new under the sun. And when we started working on this, and I've said this to you, Bruce, sometimes we're working on information, and some folks would like to think that the work they're doing in a particular area is like, just the newest, innovative, revolutionary, they're tackling something that, has never been done and is saving, the world. And the fact of the matter is we don't get where we are right now and to even work on this issue had it not been for you and so many other people who will be acknowledged very soon, and a piece that we are working on to further promote what we're trying to do via this act. But I just want to say thank you. And Bruce, I know you have some time constraints, but I have 3 questions in the chat box that are coming up. We want to let everybody give their testimony, and we're going to hear from them. So please stay as long as you can, because I know that there are a ton of my colleagues who have questions that they would like for you to answer. The next person we're going to ask to testify is Allison Cohen. Allison, please state your name for the record and proceed with your testimony. And I just want to also note for the record, because it's important to give credit where credit is due, Allison was testifying in another hearing this spring, Councilman Jones, when we were in the midst of learning how to have a committee meeting over Teams. And it was during that time that without any regulation, without being asked to give the demographics, a part of her testimony was, let me tell you what my board looks like. Let me tell you what the executives look like. Let me tell you about the makeup on my staff. And Rachel and I are texting in my office saying, don't tell me it's not possible. She just did it, voluntarily. So thank you, Allison, and we appreciate your testimony. Please state your name and proceed.
Thank you, Councilwoman Parker. I want to say anecdotally that interaction, that 1-minute interaction, made my year. And, I assume you meet thousands of people every day. And so the fact that you remember that, I was really delighted to get the invitation to testify for this bill. Good afternoon, committee members and Chairperson Parker. My name is Allison Cohen. I'm president and CEO of a company called Bicycle Transit Systems. I'm honored to appear before you today in support of the Walter Lomax Jr. Transparency in Business Act and legislative package. Before commenting specifically on the bill, I'd like to give you some context about my company and my personal journey. As mentioned, I lead a company called Bicycle Transit Systems. We're headquartered here in Philadelphia. We're 100% focused on operating bike share systems. We operate Indigo here in Philly, Los Angeles, and Las Vegas. We have 130 employees nationwide, including 50 in Philadelphia. And I'm proud to say we've just signed a contract with the city to continue operating Indigo for the next 10 to 20 years. Personally, I've been eating, breathing, and sleeping bike share for the last 13 years. Since I first started in 2010 working from my home in Mount Airy, I launched Capital Bike Share in Washington, D.C., and equity was considered, but mostly as an afterthought. A few stations were placed in low-income neighborhoods, and that was that. The decision makers and the associated bike share industry were mostly white. Philadelphia changed that after most cities in the U.S. launched bike share with equity as an afterthought, and I led these launches, D.C., Boston, New York City, Chicago. In 2015, Mayor Nutter's MOTU changed the narrative. The leadership applied for and received funding to put equity at the center of the new bike share system with the creation of the Better Bike Share Partnership. Philadelphia became and has remained as a nationwide leader in equitable bike share. However, I always observed that most of the folks working on bike share equity were people of color. Most of the industry leadership and city leadership staff nationwide were white. This dynamic was escalated in 2017 as Silicon Valley got into bike share, including Uber and Lyft. These folks learned to talk the talk around equity, but when it came down to actual investment, recruiting, the hard work of actually creating equitable and inclusive workplaces from leadership to field staff, there was very little there. I do not claim myself innocent. As a white person, I went through my first 41 years of life not understanding the privilege that my skin color gave me. I'm proud of what I achieved, and I now fully understand that I did not earn it completely. The color of my skin has absolutely given me a head start. Growing up in the suburbs in a strong school system, generational wealth, parents and academics who also had a similar head start. Through 2015, I did work on bike share equity. I also had a more diverse staff than most, given that we are a women-owned and led company. I'm LGBTQ versus the mostly white male industry. However, little of the diversity in my company was due to intentional and strategic work. I would do what most well-meaning white leaders do, which is hope for more diverse applicants, wonder why I'm not getting more, and then grudgingly hire more white people into positions of power. On January 20th, 2016, the new president was inaugurated, a very upsetting day for myself and many Americans. My wife went to DC for the Women's March. I parked at Please Touch Museum and ran my triple stroller with my 3 baby daughters down to the Art Museum to see this supposedly amazing moment of women's solidarity. The next day at work, I was comparing stories with other colleagues, and a Black leader in my company told me that she didn't go. She didn't provide much detail, but it was clear there was more to the story. In my own research, I started to understand the tip of the iceberg between the privilege of being a white woman and the oppression that white women have caused versus the multiple paths of discrimination that women of color have endured for generations. A few days later, I asked a couple of employees to sit down with me and provide any feedback they would feel comfortable giving me about how bike transit is doing as an employer and me as a white leader with a significantly white leadership group. Thus began my own journey. The feedback I got from these wonderful staff members was that nothing internally was terrible or horrid, but that I've been tone deaf to people of color in leadership being the only one, and there was nothing intentional we were doing to break that pattern. Soon after, I started a diversity and inclusion leadership group, which we called Boost. We started integrating equity, whether it's for income, race, gender identity, into all aspects of our employee handbook, whether it was lunch breaks, technology choices, bonuses, everything. I started to personally be able to recognize when bias may be entering into a colleague's comment, opinion, a decision, and be able to start to see through them. On a personal front, I listened to podcasts about whiteness, learned about microaggressions and intersectionality. Raising white children, my wife and I changed our parenting language and styles, books we read, and pointing out even just this weekend when every cartoon character in some movie we're watching that we see is white. Even while doing this work and being introspective, I used my privilege to get into a nearby good public school kindergarten for our oldest. I had my own self-justification at the time. Finally, it didn't sit well with me. As we biked past our local neighborhood school every morning, I was implicitly giving my children a message that this school was not for them. The next year, we moved to Houston Elementary, our neighborhood school, and are trying to be humble, not colonizing community members there. This conversation continues all the time as to how our decisions as white parents in a mostly Black school impacts the other kids, other families, and the school as a whole. Back at work, the structure of Boost was hard to maintain. So finally, knowing we'll be here for 10 to 20 years with this Philadelphia contract, I was able to hire a chief equity and strategy officer. Her name's Karnisha Kwashi. I believe she's on this call. And we are now partners in running bike transit and working together to ensure that DEIJ is integrated into everything we do. For the first time in my career, I look at my leadership team and I can honestly feel that it is diverse, that I'm not in the majority. It's an incredible feeling. Returning to the legislative package at hand, as you can hear, this has been at least a 4-year journey for me, and I only regret that it hasn't been longer. However, I hope you can hear that we are trying to walk the walk and working towards truly representing the people and the values of Philadelphians. To that end, I'm proud to show the demographics of our staff, not simply all staff, as many companies have white leadership and employ many people of color. At the street level. It should break down between staff type levels so that the city can evaluate bids with that data in mind. Are people of different races and genders making decisions and doing the work? If not, does that company have a plan to move to a more diverse staff and leadership? I do believe that this legislation will also help to share the responsibility of demographic reporting with DBEs and non-DBEs, whereas right now it rests all on the DBEs. I will say that even with significant effort and investment, my company, Bike Transit, is far from done. Even in a period of time that we've been doing this work, some areas of our company have gotten whiter and more male. I continue to see that identifying this data in such a trend and documenting it rather than being embarrassed about it and covering up it's an opportunity. There's something that we are not doing or we are not doing intentionally enough that has allowed us to move away from the demographics of the communities we serve. And so we'll dig into the data and try to further institutionalize diverse hiring and retention and analyze the result. Especially over the last 4 years, I've said to my staff that we can't control what's going on outside of bike transit, but we have a little microcosm to play with and create within our four walls. To the extent that the outside world, like this legislation, is pulling in the same direction we want to go, it will help move the type of work we're doing internally to the rest of the city and beyond. Thank you to Councilmember Parker and the entire committee for support of this legislation. I'm excited about the recent election, but I do truly believe that the dismantling of systemic racism has to be done brick by brick, incrementally and locally. And this is a great brick to pull away from the foundation of systemic racism here in Philadelphia. Thank you for your time and consideration, and I will stay to answer any questions you may have.
Allison, just thank you. And we have met Cartisha. You know, she was with us the other day, and listen, in my mind, I was trying to figure out, Allison, how I could steal her. She was so good and adding value to the discussion. So Thank you so much for your willingness to stick around for questions. We'll now hear from Rita Hill, Esquire. She's a member of the Black Women's Leadership Council. Rita, please identify yourself for the record and proceed with your testimony.
Okay. Thank you, Councilwoman. My name is Rita M. Hill, and I am a member of Black Women's Leadership Council and chair of standing committees. In 2016, after over 20 years, the Black Women's Leadership Council reconvened their membership. As advocates for our community, we are distressed by current events, including falling Black household incomes resulting from low Black employment rates, failing schools resulting in the lowest graduation rates in decades, lack of economic opportunities for Black businesses, gentrifying neighborhoods and the lack of Black home ownership opportunities, healthcare disparities as COVID-19 rages in our neighborhoods, and the emergent need for criminal justice reform and the Black Lives Matters movement. I speak on behalf of our 300 plus members. Thank you, Councilwoman and Chair Sherelle Parker, Councilman and Vice Chair Derek Green, and all of the members of the Law and Government Committee for inviting the Black Women's Leadership Council to submit comments in support of bill numbers 200588, 200589, and 200590, which collectively form the Dr. Walter P. Lomax Jr. Transparency in Business Act. Black Women's Leadership Council is pleased to offer our support today on the record for the foresight of Councilwoman Parker to draft legislation that will move the needle forward on bringing transparency and accountability to the City of Philadelphia's bidding and contracting process. Given the highest rate of poverty among large metropolitan cities, this legislation will address the urgency of identifying ways to decrease economic disparities and increase economic opportunity. According to recent statistics, minority businesses make up just 2% of the business population in Philadelphia. The lack of participation in economic opportunities impacts our ability to bring stability and build wealth for our families and our community. We believe when our community is stabilized, the well-being of our families and children are enhanced, improved, and increased. Presenting the demographics of a firm such as race, ethnicity, and gender identity of that firm, including salary range, job titles, and length of employment, will go far in support of the city's diversity goals by disclosing upfront the diversity or lack thereof of the firms seeking to do business with the City of Philadelphia. Also requiring contractors to disclose the demographics of the entities from which they draw workers will also provide disclosure opportunities for firms to meet diversity goals throughout the contracting process. More importantly, collecting this data every 6 months will also provide opportunities for active monitoring and compliance with the city's diversity goals. So in closing, during this very volatile and racially charged moment in our city and country's history, we must seek and find opportunities to move the needle forward on race, equity, and parity in all aspects of our lives. Economic opportunity is the catalyst to end poverty, housing, and food insecurity, improve education, healthcare, and will address the over-incarceration of members of our community due to the lack of living wage jobs and opportunities to participate in society in a meaningful way. With COVID-19 ravaging our community, we are acutely aware of the disparities that require redress if we are to move forward in a way that promotes healing and equitable inclusion. Councilwoman Parker's legislation is a first step in the direction of real equity, real inclusion, and real economic opportunity for minority businesses in the city of Philadelphia. And we are honored to wholeheartedly offer our support for the Dr. Walter P. Lomax Jr. Transparency in Business Act. With great respect, Black Women's Leadership Council.
Thank you so much for your testimony, Rita. Again, we hope you can stay because there are questions, and we want to make sure we're able to get you on the record in response to those. We'll now hear from Kendra Moore. Kendra, please state your name for the record and proceed with your testimony.
Thank you, Council Member. Good afternoon, Chair Parker, Vice Chair Green, members of the committee. My name is Kendra Moore. I'm the Government Relations Manager for the Sustainable Business Network of Greater Philadelphia. And thank you so much for inviting SBN's testimony on the Dr. Walter P. Lomax Jr. Transparency in Business Act and legislative package. Definitely appreciate the opportunity to share our thoughts with you all today. As some of you may know, over the past few years, SBN has really focused on procurement as a key tool for triple bottom line businesses in the region to really grow and thrive. And when procurement works well, the process can actually encourage participation and foster the growth of diverse local suppliers. These businesses, in turn, then produce local supply chains, boost job creation in communities where people face barriers to employment, and generate local tax revenue. And of course, at a time when Philadelphia desperately needs to rebuild in a more equitable, inclusive, and climate resilient way, it's critical that we adopt procurement reforms that will enhance the transparency of the process while supporting local independent business and ultimately create a more diverse pool of local suppliers. As some of you may know, SBN has been working on procurement and discussing with its members how we can diversify our supply chains within the network. And we're also launching a Rebuild with Equity and Inclusion series, a year-long workshop series to target these questions and how we can do this more thoughtfully and intentionally as the year goes on. Mm-hmm. And while we know that more transparent and inclusive procurement practices can have significant benefits for the economy, equity, and the environment, we also know that local independent businesses encounter significant barriers to participation. As part of our research in 2011 and 2018, we assessed some of the procurement obstacles facing these businesses and explored potential solutions for how the city could help these businesses better access procurement opportunities. And among our research findings, as you all have stated, we observed a lack of transparency in the procurement process, which the city has yet to fully address. Many of our members continue to describe the process as a black hole, particularly from a diversity perspective. And while the city has indeed made progress in collecting and providing more information, it must continue to do its work to make the process and its outcomes more transparent, which this legislation seeks to do. Furthermore, while minority, women, and disabled-owned businesses are encouraged to obtain MWDSBE certifications, the certification doesn't require them to share demographic information about their leadership or employees. And in seeking to diversify their own supply chains, our members have expressed frustration recently and over the years that these certifications just don't tell the full story. Businesses that are intentionally pursuing diversity throughout their supply chains would certainly benefit from having additional data when approaching the procurement process. In addition, the city would also benefit from understanding how representative its suppliers are relative to the city's population. And lastly, of course, more transparency would enable the public to hold the city accountable in its efforts to rebuild in a more equitable and inclusive way. So as the city seeks to address the economic impacts of the pandemic, systemic racism, and inequality, a more transparent procurement process is a key step in building a more diverse pool of suppliers for the city and laying the groundwork for more and better opportunities for people from historically marginalized groups to thrive. While we enthusiastically support transparency and diversity in procurement, we also wish to express the need for four things here. Coordination with the city's existing efforts to support diversity and local independent businesses. Number two, appropriate safeguards to ensure individual safety and proprietary business information, particularly with regard to gender identity. 3, simplicity of the reporting process for the business. And 4, a resource plan for the city to use the data being collected for decision making, including to ensure appropriate monitoring and verification while respecting individual privacy and safety. These 4 are outlined in more detail in our written testimony, and I welcome council to review it in more detail. Overall, we believe that transparency and associated safeguards will support our local independent businesses, particularly those from historically marginalized communities. The City of Philadelphia's own research tells us that when more businesses are in the supply chain, we see significant impacts for the economy and jobs. We urge the city to continue seeking ways to advance transparency and diversity in its procurement processes through a coordinated, simple, and enforceable methods that protect individual identity and support local independent businesses. Thank you again for the opportunity to share these thoughts with you. I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Kendra, for your testimony. And again, please stay around, if you can. The chair now recognizes Reverend Marshall Mitchell, pastor of Salem Baptist Church. Reverend Mitchell, if you could just please state your name for the record and then just proceed with your testimony.
Certainly, Madam Chair. Marshall Mitchell, pastor of Salem Baptist Church, resident of the city of Philadelphia, and high school friend of Councilman Derek Green. Figured I'd put that out there right now, just because he's wearing a beard. He's got gray. Mine is decorated with gray as well. We're catching up to Bruce. Let me commend you, ma'am, for your audacity, for your toughness, for your temerity, and for your willingness to be uncompromising in understanding that freedom and liberty and equality in America must have as one of its legs economic participation and fulfillment. If that is not accomplished, all of the beautiful July 4th stuff that we do down on the mall is absolutely irrelevant. In fact, it becomes something that plays with us like a very powerful cat with a very weakened mouse. And if money is not part of that, all of the glad handing and all of the kumbaya and wonderful stuff that happens in February where corporations celebrate Black people and order fried chicken and soul food at universities is meaningless. Money matters. Power concedes nothing without demand and struggle. And so I commend you for doing what you're doing. Bruce is old enough to remember all of the wonderful things that were happening across the country in the 1980s, which were very abruptly brought to an end and deemed illegal with Richmond versus Crossan, and many of the decisions that came from the Supreme Court, which made it more difficult to widen the circle of inclusion for participation of historically marginalized populations and intentionally and structurally disadvantaged people. And so to name this after Walter Lomax, who my family knew, my dad was 65 when I was born, and Walter Lomax happened to have been in my father's first wife's first grade class. And he was such a good student that he used to spend the night at their home when he was in first grade. So imagine what public schools were like when he was at the Smith School and my dad's first wife was his teacher, because we had a community. And what you are hearkening to is that we can not have a healthy commercial community if there is not inclusion, expansion of opportunity, and fairness. And I think your legislation is a flashlight. It is one of the tools that we will need on this journey. It is not the map. It is one of the tools. It is a very heady flashlight full of lumens, and it's going to shine light on many of our friends who have not lived up to all of their grand words along the way. It is a great effort at expanding employment diversity, and I am most concerned, as I have expressed to you and Rachel, that we begin to look at all of the very good, well-doing organizations in the city with enormous service contracts to serve the needs, the structural needs of Black and brown people who do not have real diversity in their higher ranks. So think about it. All of the clients and customers are Black and brown. All of them are economically dispossessed. And then all of the leadership, folks who are running nonprofits that do good work, they're not the only ones who could do this work, with executives making $600,000 and $700,000 and $280,000 and $131,000 salaries. But the senior ranks of their leadership are not diverse. And I think you're going to do a very good job of shaming people. And in our community, now it's unpopular to shame people, but I'm an old Black church pastor, and I still think shame plays a role. And we have some friends who have run organizations in this city who eat the fatted calf, but have shameful histories with respect to diversifying their senior ranks of employees. So I think this will do a great job of widening the circle of opportunity. Let me tell you why I think this is important. In a previous life, when I worked in the Congress for a guy named Floyd Flake after I worked for Bill Gray, we found out something when we had the collapse of the banking system in the late 1980s and 1990s. The Resolution Trust Corporation was formed. That was a government-sponsored enterprise which was built to clean up the banking mess and to dispose of the assets in the banking industry in the 1980s and 1990s. And what we found is the same banks that had violated the Community Reinvestment Act that crashed, cleaned up again, and those assets were bought at a fire sale by the very friends and employees of those same banks. So the people who made the mess cleaned it up. The same way that it happened in 2008, the people who made the economic mess in 2008, all the smart people from Wharton and Harvard Business School who made the mess came in, and so they made tons and tons of billions of dollars on the front end, and then they came back and bought tons and tons of billions of dollars in assets on pennies on the dollar. And the same thing has happened. So we've had inclusion and opportunity for certain groups, but not for others. And so I think your legislation is going to have to do the important work of shining the light and making sure that we have a wider circle of employee opportunity. And let me give you a real practical sense of what this means for people like Marshall Mitchell and Alan Waller. I'm at a new church now. We bought a new church. We sold our old one in Jenkintown. We bought a beautiful campus out in Abington. We got it at a fire sale price, I can say now, because we certainly own it now. And which means I've got to go out and find a general contractor for a $5 or $6 million project. Alan Waller's got to build a church where you belong, Madam Chair, and he's got a $20+ million operation. He's got to do plumbing. He's got to do electrical work. He's got to do carpentry. He's got to install the pews. He's got to install fixtures. And so he's got to choose where he buys it. If he hires a general contractor who does not intentionally go out and find Black plumbers, does not intentionally go out and find female electricians, is not intentional about going and find out if there's a company in Tennessee that African Americans own who make pews and benches down there. He's got to be intentional about that. I had to be intentional about it. And I was intentional because one day I came up here as we were doing a dance and a kabuki dance with potential general contractors. And so they're up here, people are here with their pickup trucks, people are here with their work trucks. And then I look and I see one interesting bumper sticker on the back of a pickup truck and somebody who's making the promise of making America great again. And I said, there is just absolutely no way I am going to take the money of old African-American women who have contributed faithfully since 1884, who are trying to make the kingdom of God great and who are trying to serve people, and pay people who think they are now making America great. So that contractor just had to figure out a way to come off of our list of potential general contractors. It happens, right? And so what I said was, everybody come in. If an African-American general contractor is not selected, we will sit down with the general contractor who we've selected, and we will negotiate a penny for penny, job for job amount that will go to qualified Black contractors. And so they came back and they said, we think 15% is good. And I said, I'm glad you do. 15% in my book is not good. You will wind up at 35%, or we will just go and find another general contractor. And guess what happened? We started finding Black plumbers. We started finding women who were electricians. We started finding Hispanics who were brick masons. All of a sudden, because you had a chief executive officer who was uncompromising about this. And I will say that as a companion to your legislation, and I'm sure A. Bruce Crawley will agree with me, there is nothing more powerful than a chief executive officer who looks at his or her top line officers and says, you go find me a Black plumber. And amazingly, when that happens, when you have a CEO who looks at the people he or she hires, those Black plumbers begin to manifest themselves. You begin to find people who are just as skilled but have been locked out of the old boys network, who amazingly can buy the same PVC piping that a white contractor can buy and can do the job and will perform commendably. This legislation must work in tandem with an unflinching chief executive officer who looks down the line and stares down the barrel and says, you must find this. I have one other corollary, which I know it happened at my church, and it can happen in the public sector, because there's nothing more powerful than somebody's boss's boss telling you to get this done. So the enforcement side has to be there. You've got to be willing, because you've got great laws on the book right now. We know we have the limitation of Richmond v. Crossan, but we know that the power of a chief executive officer who looks down the barrel of the gun and says, get this done, is the greatest accompaniment that legislation can have, an executive. And I'm going to close now. I know you saved the last for the Black Baptist minister to give the benediction. But I will say to you, nothing is more powerful than having a council who takes a day, the same way the House Banking Committee would take a day and have a hearing called Davis-Bacon, which ensured fair labor standards as committed by law. And on that day, twice a year, they sit down with the chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank and they ask him specifically questions. We have to do exactly the same thing for many of the contractors and service providers who are supportive of you all and who lend lip service to the idea of spreading inclusion and opportunity, and pull them in and make them demonstrate down to the dollar and down to the person. And this is not that egregious. This is not that cumbersome. This is what happens when you want to do business, is sitting them down and making them do this, and having a chief executive officer who is on the same page as you are, who looks at that senior leadership and says, get this done. The same thing happened when I was on the Board of Trustees at the University of Pennsylvania, and we were talking about why can't we find African American and Hispanic and women deans at the university. And the president, who I love and who I believe has a commitment to this, said, how do I make these deans go out and find Black and brown and women candidates? And I said, you call them all together. You tell them you're going to be respectful of collegiality and shared governance, but you tell them, damn it, go find me these candidates. If you bring me 3 candidates and you can't find a Black person or a woman or a Hispanic person, I'm going to send you back to do this work again. And it's going to take that kind of temerity and that kind of guts.
Thank you, Pastor Mitchell. I want to thank you all just so much for your testimony. I want to ask you two two questions, and one we asked the prior panel with Epps and Lee Part and Lynn Washington. And I want you to tell me, just from your perspective, when we talk about the calls for racial, social, and economic justice that we have seen reverberating across the globe, we have heard people shout Black Lives Matter, and a lot of people have become allies and have worked together to do that work, and that has been impressive. My question to you is, why do you think there has not been the same tenacity and the same sense of urgency to support efforts regarding moving folks to self-sufficiency or access to economic opportunity, as there has been in terms of calls to reform the police department, focus on criminal justice reform? Why has the economic issue not become the central rallying point for those who are actively engaged in that movement?
Yeah, well, for Black people, we are too distracted, right? One beautiful thing about doing business is if you're distracted trying to do business, you're toast, right? So if you can be distracted by people, sometimes even who are on your political and ideological team, you will not pay attention to the long-term sustainable things that have to take $1 out of somebody's pocket and put it in somebody else's. And what I would challenge the chamber and others to do is to stop viewing the set size. We've seen in countries and places and universities and industries where people diversify, they're not fighting over a pie this big, they start fighting over a pie that's this big. And so some of it requires that we actually change the way we think, to move away from our own sense of selfishness and understand that when there are more contractors working in the city, there's more business for everybody. And I think we still function as minimumist rather than maximumist. And so we're going to have to change our mind. It's a classic Philly problem. We don't think we can win and somebody else wins at the same time. And so we've got to disabuse ourselves of that and understand we can expand this idea. And I love the idea of us expanding right now because New York is in free fall. And people are moving out of New York. Guess where they should be coming? To Philadelphia, right? We should have a red welcome mat right up 95 that says, welcome to the 6th borough, and take their money and expand opportunity. So I think the political stuff, and look, I get in trouble with many of the progressives because you know me, I talk about capitalism before I sitting down at the table of brotherhood and sisterhood. Why? Because I don't want to sit at the table of brotherhood and sisterhood shaking a tin cup asking everybody else what's for dinner. It's potluck, and I want to bring something to the table also.
Madam Chair,
yes,
I'd
Mr.
like to
Crowley.
add to that. And you say that there's been a difficult time getting these large corporations to weigh in on economic issues in the way that they have reacted to police brutality and the like. Well, I'm very close to my clients, and one of them I'm on the board of, and those people are very much concerned about protecting their brand. And when they see people out on the street in the tens of thousands, city by city, contemporaneously all over the country, and when they see that happening in Sweden, and we see it in France, all over the world, they see that the Black Lives Matter and those affiliated organizations have convening power. And if you have convening power, you can damage the hell out of somebody's brand. And they are being reactive. And one of the things that's been an issue in the advertising agency business is the fact that immediately seeing the size of the convened groups, large corporations that have never said anything about Black folks in any meaningful way started to do hashtag Black Lives Matter all over the internet, all over the social media. They were in it because of self-protection. And that's a lesson to us. We've got to, while we talk about doing these things, the multi-generational, multiracial, aggregation of people who are out in those streets across America opened some eyes in corporate America. And they didn't want to get left out, nor did they want to get burned. And they thought they could be.
Thank you, Mr. Crawley. Allison?
Yeah, I'd like to add in direct response to your question, Councilperson Parker, about why there has been so much energy around the police movement, not necessarily the economic movement. I think as human beings, we are dumb and we can only, the videos, I think, you know, the videos of police brutality, you know, which is a new form of violence against, you know, people who are suffering from that violence. However, seeing it firsthand, I think probably many people on this call who are people of color have been suffering various forms of discrimination since you were a child. And I may have heard that, but having never experienced that, it is really hard to, it's hard to convene around that. And I've heard so many white people say, you know, watching the George Floyd video for 9 minutes and seeing these firsthand, I think that has really, you know, unfortunately, I think that's the reality of what has brought the energy around police brutality. In terms of economics, it still is hard for us to, as humans, to deeply understand that our dollar is power and where we spend our dollar matters as much, you know, so I think this transparency is actually, you know, one way to demonstrate that dollar is power, and following that dollar, even when you throw away something, seeing the dumps, that is, you know, so that education part of it is how our dollar is power somehow can help bring as much energy to this movement.
Thank you, Allison. Rita or Kendra, anything you want to add?
Well, I'd just like to say, Councilwoman, that Black Women's Leadership Council talks about these issues every week on the radio, on our radio show on WURD. And what we say and what we have learned is that because police brutality, police reform is an emergent issue, it's the issue we're dealing with right now. It's a response to police brutality. It's a response to a police killing. So all the energy is focused there. But what we know is that the economics, the healthcare, the education, the political parts, that's all intertwined. We're all part of one movement, and each part will have to be addressed. So I just think that the reason why the police reform, the police brutality, the criminal justice reform is in the news and it's making headlines, whereas economic disparities are not. It's because of what we're dealing with and what is emergent, what is central to what's going on in the public at that time.
Thank you, Marshall Mitchell.
Yeah, Councilwoman, economic brutality kills thousands and thousands and thousands of times more people every year than the scourge of police brutality.
I'm sorry, Pastor Mitchell. You went out for a second. Can you repeat what you just said again for the record? I didn't hear it all.
Absolutely. Economic and financial brutality kill thousands and thousands and thousands of times more people every year than police brutality. It is not videotaped, but we see it on Lancaster Avenue in West Philadelphia. We see it on Wadsworth Avenue. There's no videotape of it, but all you have to do is go and look at the carnage in the neighborhoods where it occurs. Germantown Avenue, Diamond Street. That is economic brutality. It doesn't last 8 minutes and 46 seconds. What it does is it lasts when you go to the schools, when you go to the emergency room, when you see the dilapidation and collapse of churches. That's the way we've got to be able to quantify it. So as Allison Cohen said, you don't see that video of it, but you actually see it in Technicolor in real life.
Wow. Kendra, anything you want to add, Kendra?
Yeah, I just really appreciate the thoughts of my colleagues on this call today. And Councilmember, you had mentioned to SBN not that long ago that, you know, we hear a lot of talk it's really time to put the talk into action. And I know that this legislative package is doing just that, and it's going to take a lot of work from all angles. So this is just one piece of this bigger puzzle, touching on education and renewal of corridors. Businesses are just one part of this strategy, and very much grateful to be a part of the conversation and a resource to you and council as we move ahead. So thank you again.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Councilmember Green.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This has been an outstanding conversation. I've been dealing with another issue as we speak. This is such an important conversation. And just for the panelists, this panel, and I wanted to ask this to a previous panel, but didn't have an opportunity to do so. How do you see the city using this information to make the investments that we're talking about? I think the work that Councilmember Park has done in reference to provide this information is so important, but it goes back to what Reverend Mitchell said about those in power making that decision. Too often, what we have seen in the public sector from a procurement perspective,
Councilmember Green, move forward. The stenographer, you're coming through choppy, and the stenographer's having a problem hearing you.
I'm in another meeting at the same time. So what I'm saying is, how do you see the city using this information to make sure that we're holding decision making accountable, especially at procurement? That's the issue where time is of the essence. We always hear about, well, we'll do it next time. We'll do it next time. We've been doing things next time for 50 years. How do you see this information being used to hold the city accountable to make decisions to make sure we have better influence than what we're trying to do?
Anybody, Mr. Crowley?
Yes.
Kendra? Or Rita?
Yes, I was going to say thank you, Councilwoman and Councilman Green. What I think is one of the most important aspects of the legislation is that there's a 6-month reporting period. That's built in a solution to just getting to the end of the contract and not having the participation goals met. When you have a 6-month review, that allows monitoring, that allows action to be initiated, that allows adjustments to be made, and that's never been done before. So I think that is one of the central issues in this legislation that's going to allow the city to be held accountable, because built into the legislation is an inner monitoring device.
Yeah. Bruce or Allison, you have a response? Allison.
Yeah, and I'll respond as a recent bidder for a contract. I think some of the devil's in the details in terms of how a particular procurement rates the various aspects of the procurement. Typically, there's, it's 30% cost proposal, 30% this. I know that we did get some advantages. I'm not officially a WBE, so we didn't get any DBE points. We did get advantages for being an LBE, a local business enterprise. It was 5%. I was bidding against Uber and Lyft, two major public companies. I was told during the procurement process that you're playing up local, that's great, but we have a lot of money on the table coming from other bidders. So I think that really comes down to the city. If there is a well-funded bidder for some particular process or giving a better price versus a bidder who aligns with the values, how much are each of these aspects of the bids valued when it comes to choosing the winning bidder? I can't answer that. That's really, Is it 5%? Is it 40%? I mean, that really comes down to, and I think depending on the industry, some folks might say, well, if you're really, focusing on total diversity or total local, you might be sacrificing innovation because not all the innovation in the world is happening in Philadelphia. So I'm not going to answer that, but I think it comes down to choosing the particular bids, how much, the diversity of staff and leadership and local aspects of the bid measure in that weighting of choosing the winning bidder.
Okay, thank you so very much. We want to thank each and every one of you for your testimony, and just a little bit of housekeeping for us today. One, there is no COVID press conference today, and that's why we did not need to recess. I needed to say that. I also needed to say to Pastor Marshall that, Pastor Marshall, it is not lost on us the comments you made about some of the larger, even nonprofit organizations whose executive teams are not as diverse as we would have expected them to be, given the hundreds of millions of dollars that they have been given the opportunity to manage on behalf of the city to provide services to Black and brown people. So I do want you to know that they too will have to report. So that won't have to be a next step. They are covered under this legislation. We will have to close, but I need to ask Bruce Crawley for the record to just close us out with a comment on, and I want to go back to something that you said when you were talking to us about the census, and the data. You talked about a research tool. You talked about it being a research tool because the data is usually hidden, like when you went through even the Hispanic data and how you have to go through it. Bruce, can you give us just sort of a reference?
This first phase is a benchmarking phase. You collect the data, and you find out what people are doing and what have they done, and you can't solve the problem getting that initial influx of data. But what you can see very readily is whether the places where the economic benefit has flowed is in consort with the places that you wanted it to flow. And if you see that contracts are being let on a regular basis from the city of Philadelphia, and virtually none of it is benefiting companies and potential workers in North Philadelphia, then you come back in the next round of contracts, and a part of the RFP process is we are giving special recognition and value to companies that bid and commit to using employees from North Philadelphia and placing a branch in North Philadelphia. You don't know yet what you can possibly glean from the data, but the data by itself, together with what you expect to achieve, what your goals are for getting this done, can change the way Philadelphia's economy works.
Thank you. I want to thank you all for your testimony, and I'm looking at something else we need to give on the record, and we want you all to be able to give a 60-second response because we need to get your responses on the record. What is your response to any firm that is currently doing business with the city of Philadelphia who may say that this is another onerous reporting requirement and this is not necessary, and we, I don't understand why we need to do this? What is your response to a firm who thinks that this is unnecessary? 60 seconds, each of you, if you will, because we need to get it on the record, your responses. I'll start with
I'll set the tone as the elongated speaker of the hour and the Baptist minister and say that the response to that should be shame on you.
Thank you. Allison or Kendra?
Say, if you want to do business in the city of Philadelphia, the demographics of your staff should strive to represent Philadelphia. And if it doesn't, that's okay for now, but let's be transparent about it and give us a plan to get there.
Right. Kendra?
Yes, echoing Allison's thoughts there, and also just would offer a solution and encourage that business to reach out to folks perhaps at Commerce, to the Office of Business Services, or Procurement to see how we can help them, enable them to do the right thing.
Thank you, Bruce Crawley. We'll close with Rita. Rita, you still on? I don't see you in the box.
I am. I'm on.
So Rita, what's your response to a firm who says this is not necessary and it's onerous?
I would say transparency and accountability. They should be in support of transparency and accountability, and this legislation is going to put that forward.
Bruce?
One, I would think that they don't really want to do the work. And if they don't want the work that much, then let them go. I mean, this is not onerous. This is filling out forms that give you an understanding of how they will represent the city. And if they don't want to let you know how they want to represent the city, let them go. There are other bidders who would want to participate. And finally, I would say, I don't know what they would do if they came and attacked the city council and you had already gotten the support of the mayor, if you had already gotten the support of state reps, if you'd already gotten the support of state senators, and you have had meetings with editorial boards at the Inquirer, for example, and let them know what the thinking is behind what they say is onerous paperwork. I think they would be run out of the editorial board meeting. And I think if you are sure that your colleagues are united with you, where can they go? Who are they complaining to?
Got it. We want to thank you all for your testimony, and I have to ask for their record. Is there anyone who has any comments or question for members of this panel? Hearing none, we want to say thank you to you all for being here. And you can feel free to disconnect as we are about to go into our public meeting. Is there anyone else here to testify on bill numbers 200588, 200589, and 200590 whose name has not yet been called? I don't see anything typed in the chat box. So this will conclude our hearing, and we will go into our public meeting. There being no further questions from members of the committee and no other witnesses to testify, I will ask if there is anyone else who is present, whose name that we failed to call, that wishes to offer any testimony on the bills. Hearing none, again, we thank all of the panels, and we ask that you, again, disconnect from our session so that we can go into our public hearing. Yeah, we're going to ask you, everyone who testified. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Great job.
Thank you. This concludes the public hearing of the committee. We will now go into a public meeting to consider the action to be taken on the bills before the committee today. We are now going to formally and officially reconvene the public meeting and to call the roll. We will now convene the public meeting. Rachel, will you please call the roll to take attendance? Members that are in attendance, will you please indicate that you are present when your name is called? And again, just say a few words so we can ensure that your image is on the screen.
Vice Chair Derek Green.
Present.
Councilmember Brian O'Neill.
Present. And good job, Madam Chairwoman, as always.
Thank you, Councilman.
Councilmember Cindy Bass.
Good afternoon. I am present. Thank you.
Councilmember Helen Gim.
Present.
Councilmember Mark Squilla.
Present.
And Councilmember Curtis Jones.
I am present. Thank you for this important hearing, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councilman Jones. I want to thank you. We will now go into our public meeting. This is a public meeting to amend Bill number 200588. The chair recognizes Councilmember Green for a motion on the amendment to Bill number 200588.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
I offer an amendment to Bill number 200588. A copy of the amendment has been circulated to all members of the committee. I move that the amendment to Bill number 200588 be approved.
Second.
It was seconded by Councilmember Jones. It has been moved and properly seconded that the amendment to Bill number 200588 be approved. All those in favor of the motion will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? The ayes have it, and the motion carries, and the amendment to Bill number 200588 has been approved. The chair recognizes
Madam Chair, just for the record, I know that Councilmember Sanchez was also present. I don't think she was recognized.
Oh, Councilmember Sanchez?
Yes, my apologies, Madam Chair. I was having a technology problem, but I am present and want to be recorded as voting aye on the previous amendment. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Sanchez. The chair recognizes Councilmember Green for a motion on Bill number 200588 as amended.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move that Bill number 200588 as amended be reported from this committee with a favorable recommendation, and further move that the rules of council be suspended to permit first reading of this bill at the next session of council.
Second. Is there a second?
Second.
It was seconded by Councilmember Helen Gim. It's been moved and properly seconded that Bill number 200588 as amended be reported from this committee with a favorable recommendation, and further move that the rules of council be suspended to permit first reading of this bill at the next session of council. All those in favor of the motion will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed?
Aye.
Those opposed? The ayes have it, and the motion carries. The chair recognizes Councilmember Green for a motion on the amendment to Bill number 200589.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I offer an amendment to Bill number 200589. A copy of the amendment has been circulated to all members of the committee. I move that the amendment to Bill number 200589 be approved.
Second.
It was just seconded by Councilmember Bass. It's been moved and properly seconded that the amendment to Bill number 200589 be approved. All those in favor of the motion will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? The ayes have it, and the motion carries, and the amendment to Bill number 200589 has been approved. The chair recognizes Councilmember Green for a motion on Bill number 200589 as amended.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move that Bill number 200589 as amended be reported from this committee with a favorable recommendation, and further move that the rules of council be suspended to permit first reading of this bill at the next session of council.
Second.
It's been seconded by Councilmember Gim that Bill number 200589 as amended be reported from this committee with a favorable recommendation, and further move that the rules of council be suspended to permit first reading of this bill at the next session of council. All those in favor of the motion will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? The ayes have it, and the motion carries. The chair recognizes Councilmember Green for a motion on the amendment to Bill number 200590.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I offer an amendment to Bill number 200590. A copy of the amendment has been circulated to all members of the committee. I move that the amendment to Bill number 200590 be approved.
Second.
It's been seconded by Councilmember Bass that the amendment to Bill number 200590 be approved. All those in favor of the motion will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? The ayes have it, and the motion carries, and the amendment to Bill number 200590 has been approved. The chair recognizes Councilmember Green for a motion on Bill number 200590 as amended.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move that Bill number 200590 as amended be reported from this committee with a favorable recommendation, and further move that the rules of council be suspended to permit first reading of this bill at the next session of council.
Second.
It's been seconded by Councilwoman Gim that bill number 200590 as amended be reported from this committee with a favorable recommendation, and further move that the rules of council be suspended to permit first reading of this bill at the next session of council. All those in favor of the motion will signify by saying aye.
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 Those opposed? The ayes have it and the motion carries. This concludes the meeting of the Law and Government Committee. I want to give a special thanks to all of those who testified, but a huge thanks to all of my colleagues for your patience in making sure that we were able to get all of the information we needed on the record. In addition to that, to all of the stakeholders who have offered amendments that we did not introduce today, please know that we are vetting every recommendation that you have given to us. We will cross-reference them with the law department, and we will see how we can continue to be inclusive and move forward together and making some systemic change in how the city of Philadelphia does business. I want to thank the staffs of all of my colleagues who are on today. You don't get a chance to see them, but they're Rachel, that's the clerk from my office, who you heard today helping to keep us going. There is a staff equivalent for all of the members who are on here today. And I just want them to know we can't see you, but we thank you for your work in helping to get this done. This concludes the business before the Committee on Law and Government today. Thank you so very much for your attendance.
Great job, Madam Chair. Thank you.